All right, I think we'll begin. I think everybody's here. All participants will join the meeting with all participants will join the meeting with muted microphones. Please rename yourself to include your first name, last name, and affiliation if you have one. Please do not unmute or mute yourself. The host will take care of it. To participate in the discussion, please select the raise hand function. Find this by clicking on the participants button at the bottom of the screen, and a window will pop up with a raise hand button at the bottom. The presenters will then call on the participants and unmute their microphones. If you are on the phone, you can use *9 to raise your hand. If you have any technical difficulties, please contact Regine Foley via the chat box or at rfoley@ctps.org or call her at 857-702-3704. This meeting is accessible to people with disabilities. Zoom products are compliant with exceptions with the following standards: Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 Level AA standards and revised Section 508 standards. If you require any additional accommodations in order to participate fully in this meeting, please contact Regine Foley of the MPO staff at rfoley@ctps.org or call her at 857-702-3704. I'd like to welcome everybody to a meeting of the Boston Region Metropolitan Planning Organization. I'm David Moeller. I represent Secretary Jamie Tesler here. Go ahead and call the roll, Jonathan.
Sure. Mass DOT seat 2.
John Bouchard, representing Highway Administrator Jonathan Gulliver from Swampscott.
Thank you. MassDOT Highway Division.
Don Romano here.
MBTA.
Jillian Linnell, representing the General Manager.
Thank you. Massachusetts Port Authority. Okay. Metropolitan Area Planning Council. Okay. MBTA Advisory Board.
Brian Kane, present.
Thank you. Regional Transportation Advisory Council.
Hunter Diggins, here. Thank you.
City of Boston, Boston Transportation Department.
On mute, Tom Katz is. Good morning, everybody. City of Boston, representing Mayor Martin Walsh. Thank you.
Thank you. City of Boston, BPDA.
Hi, Jim Fitzgerald with BPDA, representing Mayor Walsh in the City of Boston.
Thank you. At large, City of Everett.
Jay Monty, representing Mayor DiMaria and the City of Everett.
At large, City of Newton.
Good morning, David Kozis, representing Mayor Ruth Ann Fuller in the City of Newton.
At large, Town of Arlington.
Morning, Town of Arlington. Daniel Amstutz, representing Select Board Chair John Hurd and MPO area towns.
At large, Town of Brookline.
Heather Hamilton for the Town of Brookline.
Inner Core Committee, City of Somerville.
Tom Bent, City of Somerville, representing Mayor Joe Curtatone in the Inner Core.
Minuteman Advisory Group on Interlocal Coordination, Town of Acton.
Austin Saganowitz, representing Town of Acton and Magic Subregion.
Metro West Regional Collaborative, City of Framingham.
Thatcher Keyser, representing Mayor Spicer, Metro West.
North Shore Task Force, City of Beverly.
Darlene Wynn, representing Mayor Michael Cahill for the North Shore Task Force.
North Suburban Planning Council, City of Woburn.
Yes, good morning, Tina Cassidy, representing Woburn Mayor Scott Galvin and the North Suburban Planning Council.
South Shore Coalition, Town of Rockland. Okay. Southwest Advisory Planning Committee, Town of Medway.
Southwest Planning Advisory Committee, Peter Pelletier.
Thank you. And Three Rivers Interlocal Council, Town of Norwood, Neponset River Regional Chamber.
Good morning, Tom O'Rourke from Town of Norwood, representing the Trick sub-region.
And I will just go back to see if the Metropolitan Area Planning Council is here. Okay. Ex officio members, Federal Highway Administration.
Good morning, Ken Miller, Federal Highway Administration.
And Federal Transit Administration. I believe that calls the roll, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, John. Next item on the agenda is the chair's report. I don't have one, but I'm going to call in John Bouchard to present on the TIP process and the projects that are over budget. So John, when you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Moeller, Chair. Appreciate it. I'm going to go through a few slides on our STIP reliability stuff and then discuss the projects that we discussed at the last MPO meeting and some of the issues with project costs. And I'll take questions at the end. Let's see. So what we call STIP reliability is the ability for both MassDOT municipal projects to be delivered on time, on budget, and within the original programmed STIP year. Little background, as you know, programming recommendations are made on the project. Well, hold on one second, Chair.
Yes. So John's actually he's also in the process of trying to pick up his wife from minor surgery. So we're on pause for a second.
Mr. Chair, should Eric Barassa introduce himself while we're waiting?
You can mark Eric here. Eric?
Sorry, Mr. Chair, I apologize for that.
Hold on a minute, John. Eric's going to just read.
Right.
Yeah, thank you all. This is Eric Barassa from the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. Sorry, I'm here.
All right, John, you're ready. Whenever we're ready when you are.
All right. Sorry, I just had to take that quick call.
No worries.
Okay, so the background, the purpose of programming recommendations that we make at readiness days is to make sure we have a reliable STIP, and we apply our recommendations based on all average size state municipal projects. We've identified some interim and ideal recommendations for STIP years 1 through 4. And then we try to apply those recommendations as part of our assessment at readiness days. And mainly, the items that we consider are what design phase we're at, what's the right-of-way status, what are the environmental permits that are in process, and we do that for each year. So as I just stated, what are those factors? Right-of-way status, right-of-way acceptance and approval, and environmental permitting. There's a ripple effect. We had 88 projects in the STIP years for 21 through 25. 52% of those were MassDOT consultant projects, and 40% of those were municipal consultants. And then we had another 8% that were in-house designed by our district or Boston offices. So what are we doing to have a better reliability? We've identified a balanced quarterly advertising program. We're not overwhelming industry and we're not overwhelming our own team in delivering that program. We are conducting municipal priority of projects meetings with our cities and towns and with our designers on a quarterly basis. This is in addition to the regular priority of projects meetings that we have weekly on all of our projects, but we've invited the cities and towns and their designers to participate in these municipal ones to get a better understanding of what some of the challenges and some of the items that are outstanding on a project design. We've updated our project initiation standard operating procedure, and we've also recently will be issuing in the next several weeks our pre-25% engineering directive. So the balanced quarterly ad program, we're trying to have, a number of projects every quarter. And again, it's based on reliability. What can we deliver? And then we're measuring our ability to meet those quarters within the design program date by approximately, by 30 days. And we don't want to overwhelm industry or our own team. So we've identified 35% of our program, no more than 35% of our program will be advertised in any one quarter. As I stated, we've scheduled these municipal priority of projects. We've done 2 of them so far. We're going to do another one in June and then likely in September. We're refreshing our project development and design guide. That's the PDDG. I quickly referenced that we're issuing an engineering directive on our pre-25% design SOP, and we have a cost estimating committee, which I think will factor into some of the discussion on the projects I'm going to touch on in a moment. Our success factors is having a partnership with the municipality. The chief engineer has identified and is holding a stakeholder collaboration with several of our district office members, as well as several members from the municipalities that are spread throughout the entire Commonwealth to get some regular engagement with municipalities to sustain our STIP. Hearing from them what their challenges are, and then how we can address those and how we can do things better. The STIP project lifecycle is a 5-year process. As I said, we've identified some ideal and interim milestone goals that we'd like to, we want to share with the regional MPOs in the future and see how we can give you some guidance as to how we're evaluating projects. So this slide is a little bit small, but in year 1, some of the things that we're looking for are, that we've already achieved final design, the right-of-way has been approved or accepted and is moving through appraisals and acquisitions, relocation and advanced acquisitions on, projects if it's a significant amount of right-of-way. I'm not going to go through every one of these, but these are some of the goals that we kind of set. If we can achieve some of these goals, then we think we have a better, more reliable STIP. These are the ideal, what we're striving for in the future. What we had identified for interim was, we had achieved in this year 1, 75% design had been approved. The right-of-way has been accepted so that the next phase can begin. If it's an Article 97 land disposition project, that it's been identified and we've prepared the necessary legislation for filing with the State House, some of those items. I'm not going to go into the specifics, but I'll be happy to talk about these later. So for project discussions, and I hope I'm sorry I'm going a little bit fast, but for project discussions, we have cost increases, and we discussed MassDOT contingencies, at the last meeting. And, I think the chair was trying to be clear, and I was trying to be clear. These are not just some add-ons that Mass Highway Tax or MassDOT, tax on at the end to make projects go over budget, or it's like a finder's fee. Oh, we got to do this. These are things that are known. It's part of delivering the project. It's, MassDOT's field staff under construction engineering, overseeing the construction, the contingency for overruns, which we estimate at 10%. We need to, not every project is built exactly as designed. We may end up putting an extra piece of curbing in, or we may need to do a driveway because there's been changes since the survey was done. Traffic police is another item. So these are kind of what we add on as contingencies that are part of delivering the overall project. There's some other costs, which I'll show in the next slide. Utility relocation costs. For private utilities, we have a 50% reimbursement, and for public utility, we have generally 100% reimbursement. Now, there are certain milestones. The utility needs to move within a certain time frame, et cetera, to achieve that that 50% reimbursement. But trying to identify those costs upfront so they can be programmed within the project is a challenge. I call transit costs when we have projects that affect the railroads. We may need railroad flaggers, or in regional transit, we may have shelters, we may have bus stops, and you'd think, oh, well, just pop a shelter in over there. But Sometimes we need right-of-way. We need to make sure we can get the sidewalk around the shelter. If we have a bus stop, we may need to put in a drop lane for a bus to get out of the traveled way so we're not impeding traffic. So we'd like to identify these things again as part of the pre-design or preliminary design phase, such that we can acquire the necessary right-of-way if required. These costs are then added to the office estimate, and we identify the tip cost, which we call the total federal participating cost. The summary of above these line items get to the TFPC. So on specific projects, I'm going to talk about those in the 21 through 25 tip that we discussed at the last meeting. I think I've at least discussed the projects that are in years 1, 2, and 3. I'm not going to get into all of the details, but I want to share how, the costs. And I took this information from Matt Genova's spreadsheet, which, just to give everyone bearing, starting with Everett, Ferry Street, and the number that says 25 million to 29.1 million. 25 million was in the original programming, and now with the 100% or the PS&E that has been submitted, that project cost to the STIP is $29.1 million. And how we're going to get to that number is the office estimate is 24.2 million. That's basically the summary of the construction items that the designer has prepared for the project. That's at 24.2 million. And someone would say, geez, we're at 24.2. That's within the 25 that was originally on the STIP. We should be good. Well, that's not necessarily the case because these other add-ons need to be factored into that cost. The 10% contingency for overruns based on the Everett project is $2.42 million. 5% for construction engineering, and that's because the construction engineering varies by the project size. Less than $20 million, and it's generally 10% for staff. More than $20 million, generally 5%. That would total $1.21 million. 5% traffic police is $1.21 million, and lo and behold, 24.2 becomes $29 million. I'm going to go through all of these projects for us again. If you have an individual question, I would ask that you raise your hand, and Jonathan can unmute you, and we could talk about it. For Woburn, New Boston Street, project was originally on Matt's spreadsheet at 18 million, and currently it's showing up at 23.3 million. Here's the breakdown. The office estimate is 18.4. We have 10% for construction. We have 5% for construction engineering. We have 5% for traffic police. And then we have utility reimbursements totaling about 1.36. And that brings us to the total federal participating cost of 23.5. Now, that project is in the final design phase. There are a couple of additions and changes being implemented right now, and they're going through some permitting through the MEPA process, which may identify some additional project work that's required. It's our contention that we look at that additional project work as a result of this new bridge, or rebuilding a bridge that's been out of service for 40 years. It's going to cause some traffic-related issues in adjacent communities as well as in Woburn, and we're looking to get those funded as part of a future project and not have to build them as part of the bridge. But we're working on the final of that part of the project. For Framingham, Union Ave, again, using Matt's spreadsheet, 10.2 was originally shown for programming. It's up to 11.1. That breakdown is the summary of items, or the office estimate is 9.7 million. There's the 10% contingencies for overruns, 10% for construction engineering, and then 5% for traffic police. Actually, 5% would have been just under 500. We have an estimate that was prepared by the designer, and that's about 400,000. So it's a little bit less. So this is showing up based on those numbers right now, up to $11.1 million for total federal participating cost. I advanced the slide.
John, just to let you know, there's a couple people that have questions. I don't know if you want to take them now or wait.
No, Jonathan, we're taking them at the end.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, we're going to take, my apologies. I wasn't sure if we had talked, David and I talked about probably taking them at the end. So let's see. I'm going to make sure we didn't jump 2 spots. Okay, so Littleton Air, which is Route 2A at Willow Street. project is at 2.3 million on Matt's spreadsheet, going up to 3.2 million. And the breakdown, the office estimate, the 10% contingency for overruns, construction engineering, 5% for traffic, and then utility reimbursements brings this project to 3.15, which is rounded to 3.2 million. For Reading, Route 28 at Hopkins Street, again, the breakdown is 1.7 currently. It's being requested to go to 2.1, and the breakdown, 1.5 million is the office estimate, the 10% for overruns, 10% for construction engineering, traffic police, and then utility reimbursements bring us to that 2.07, which rounds to 2.1 million. Rutherford Ave is, I know, a longer term, a much larger project, and we have some uncertainty in the cost at this time. So originally it was at $115 million on Matt's spreadsheet, and it's requested to go to $166 million. In the recent 25% resubmission, the 25% phase, we're at $152 million for the office estimate. Because we're at that stage of design, we don't, we're applying a 20% contingency at this time, which is about $30 million, brings that total federal participating cost to $182 million. I wouldn't, generally I wouldn't recommend programming it at the $182 million because there's unknowns and uncertainties at this phase, but a project of this size and scope, we're going to have to make some decisions about what we're going to program and how that's going to be, spread out over the years in the step. Acton, Main Ave at Main Street, which is, what's that? Is that Kelly's Corner, I think? Project is currently programmed at 14.7 million. It's gone up to 15.3 for this request. The office estimate breakdown is 11.73 million. The 10% for overruns, 5% for construction engineering. The traffic police has been estimated because of this location at 1.1 million, which is a little bit higher than we would normally see. And then there's also 1.7 million in utility reimbursements. So that brings that project cost up to $15.3 million. For Chelsea, Broadway, project is currently programmed at 10.3 and is seeking 13.3 for programming. The office estimate is due, the office estimate is $9.7 million. The 100% is due in April of this year. At that time, I would have a better handle on the cost, but the latest information we have is going to be around 9.7 million, with our overruns are at 10%, our 5% for construction, and our traffic police. The total brings us up to 11.63 million. So either that 13.3 million, someone knows something that I don't presently know, while the estimate is being finalized. So that's an item that I don't have all of that information at this time, with the 100% due next month. Norwood, Route 1 at University Ave. Project was originally programmed at 9.8, and it's now showing at 25.7 million. This project was originally initiated in 2009. We recently received a 25% resubmittal with an estimate of $14.9 million. And, we've applied a 25% cost factor that brings it up to 18.7. I'm not sure at this time how we're arriving at $25.7 million. But I think because the project is more than 10, 12 years old when it was first initiated, and some uncertainty in the recent resubmittal, the project is showing significant increase, and I think that is being offered as a contingency for unknowns in the project scope and in timeline. Okay, so I'll wrap up the next couple slides. Bellingham is Route 126. Project is 6.1 million, and it's being requested to increase to 6.4. The breakdown is 5.1 million. In the office estimate, we received 100% submittal in November of last year at 5.1, with the overruns, construction engineering, and traffic police, we're at the 6.4, so I think we're in good shape at that number. For Peabody Central Street, project was originally programmed or shown in programming at 10.4 million. It's being sought to increase that to 15.8. With the information we currently have, the 25% was submitted in the summer in August of 2020 at 12.1 million. With contingencies, construction engineering, and traffic police at this stage, we're at 14.6, but we're really only at 25% design as of August of last year. So, I'm sure the designer and the city are working through some other issues to be seeking that 15.8 million, and it just might be some uncertainties that they've applied to the project. Framingham Edgell Road at Central Street is a traffic signal. Was programmed at 2.0 million. It's being sought to increase to 2.6. The breakdown is 1.8 million for the office estimate, 10% for each for overruns and construction engineering, traffic police, and then utility reimbursements are at $0.25 million, brings us to that sought after 2.6 million overall. And I think this is one of my last slides. For Wilmington, Route 38 Main Street, the project was programmed at 19.6. The community is seeking 24.5. The office estimate is, from January of this year at 75% design at 20.7 million. When we add in the 10% of overruns, 5% for construction engineering, and then our estimated traffic police, at 0.8 million, we bring it to $24.7 million. For Ipswich Central Street at South Main Street, project was originally programmed at 3.1 and is now seeking 5.7. That estimate is from the 25% design in August of last year at 3.3. So already the project is a little bit over budget with the add-ons and utility reimbursements. We're at about 4.56 million dollars, and as I said, we're at 25%. There's some uncertainty in the overall total federal participating cost to achieve 5.7. And I think lastly for Milford Route 16, the project was programmed at 3.9. It's seeking 10.5. The office estimate is from last March of this last year at 25%, was already nearly double at 6.2 million, with the 10% for overruns, 10% for construction engineering and traffic police, and then utility reimbursements of about $0.8 million. The total participating cost, I think we have a typo there, Mr. Chair. That's not $29 million. It's got to be a typo. So that's closer to, let's see, 1.2, 1.5. That's 7.7. 0.8 would be about $8.3 million. That is our total federal participating cost. But again, that's based on the 25% design and incomplete moving forward.
Thank you, John. Now we're taking questions. Jay Monty.
John, thank you. I appreciate the level of detail you explained here. And and from my point of view, it was never a question of whether these costs were legitimate or not. I completely understand what they are, and they are necessary costs. The question in my mind, is, and it's still kind of unanswered at this moment, which was, it seemed like we had, and I'm speaking of Ferry Street because I'm most familiar with it. If at 75%, we were 25 million. The tip reflected that 25 million. From 75 to 100, the office estimate didn't change. I think last week you mentioned actually went down a little bit. But only at this stage we're seeing these contingency and construction costs being added, or at least that's how it appears to me. Am I misreading that? It just again, the cost makes sense, but it's unclear to me when they're being added into the tip, into the number that we're seeing on the tip.
Well, the just to be clear on that, Jay, last year when this project achieved 75% design, we had just received it before we were starting to discuss cost for that particular project. And what was available at the time as we were programming the 21 through the completion of 2020, fiscal 2020 and 21 through 25, at that time, we had $25 million available, although the cost back then was over $25 million. And I think it was it was this body that made the decision that based on what we had for information at the time, I could support 25 million being a reasonable cost, for the programming. And you're right, now with the 100% and the final design being achieved and the project comes in at 24.2 for the office estimate, the add-ons, the 10% for construction overruns, the 5% for the construction engineering and the traffic police, those are not new costs. They just should have been accounted for by the designer in the final design of the project. And what I'd like to do, and we're starting with Boston MPO because I sit on the meetings every 2 weeks, is that we need to better educate in our municipalities and our designers on those numbers. And as being a designer myself for 25 years on occasion, I would have the same question. What are we using? I would like us to be more transparent with what's the cost, what's the program cost, and what's included in that. And what I've shared today, is the special sauce, and I'm being a little facetious, obviously, but those are costs that are part of delivering the project and they don't change. The items that change are utility costs on occasion where we may impact the utility that we weren't anticipating, or underground or overhead or the like. And then traffic police is a cost that we don't always control because it depends on how long the project moves forward and what the costs are in the field, for conducting that work. So we haven't done a great job overall in educating and keeping the municipalities knowledgeable about these add-ons. As you know, when we talked 2 weeks ago, people were, questioning them. And I'm not implying that we were questioning like it was, that they weren't legitimate costs. It was just like, well, why aren't these being added, prior to, coming to the end, and so we could properly program these things. They're applied by my team, at 25%, at 75%, at 100%, and that information is shared back with the designer, through the process. And then when the design is not, and as I showed in some of my slides on individual projects, where the project is not fully, is not further advanced beyond 25%, it's difficult for us to assess those costs. So we use some of those factors so that way we're tracking where that is. Now I have some more seasoned project managers that can, through interaction with the communities and with the designer, that they can see that this project is not fully cooked yet. When they go to public hearing, they hear that, there's another location down the street, or we need more sidewalk, or we need to put in a shared use path or something like that. And so they're skilled enough to try, to keep aside, a contingency cost that says, I think this project may grow because of these factors. And, and they keep track of that. And I'm hoping that they're sharing that information with the designers and with the community, so that way we're not surprised when we get to the end.
Right.
It's just some factors here.
Right. So let me add something. If your designer is designing the office estimate to the tip number, he or she is over designing your project and its cost, and it will not be delivered at the tip number. Every tip number, every programmed amount in tip includes what we assume to be the right amount for all those add-ons John showed in his chart. So to the extent that a designer is out there designing to the tip number, he or she is over designing the project because the tip number includes the add-ons.
Right. I guess my question that what I was getting at, Dave, was that, if last year we showed it at 25, my assumption would have been that all those add-ons would have been in that number last year, right? Not that, yes. And I understand it came in at the last minute, that John's team didn't have time to, get into those numbers yet, and that's a perfectly reasonable answer. But that was my confusion, was that, if our office estimate didn't change from 75 to 100, then why did the tip number change? So that was all.
Thank you, Jay. Ken?
Thank you, Jay.
Thank you, David. I was just going to say that too. Those costs are not added on at 75%, or those should be included in any total federal participating costs that you see programmed on the tip, whether it's at 25% or even be pre-25%. Those should be included in the total federal participating costs that we see. And that has always been my understanding, and so it's not that these costs are added in at the end to change the cost. There is one other wrinkle in terms of using the office estimate that may include non-participating items, which should be excluded from the total federal participating costs. So non-participating items are those things that a municipality or the state, whoever's designing it, includes that maybe extra fancy, fancy light poles or something like that, that we would not participate, or the state may not participate in the cost, and those should be excluded from the total federal participating cost. So again, you have to be careful with just using the office estimate if it includes those items. And thirdly, I just I had a question about the cost that John showed, the slides. I'm concerned a little bit about the cost where John's latest estimate, including everything, is very different from what has been programmed. And I'm just wondering why that would be. Would it be possible that that's related to some of these projects are programmed in an out year and that includes the 4% annual inflation, or is there another reason that those are different?
Ken, I was looking at some of that information, and obviously, if it's our project info system applies inflation automatically based on the tip year. So the information that I drew from in my project managers was accurate information. I didn't, because it's an odd, I wanted to try and explain the cost to the communities and the MPO members on how we achieve some of these things. But you're absolutely right. If projects are in the future, then the inflation factor of 4% per year, could change some of those numbers. But I was trying to, when I did my research and I worked with my project managers, those were the numbers that I was coming up with from our project info system. And if it is programmed in a future year, then that inflation factor is automatically applied.
Right, but thank you, John. But it seemed that there were a couple of projects where the MPO had a cost that was substantially higher than what you showed on for a couple of projects on the slides, and that's I was just curious.
Yeah, there were a few, but I wasn't able to close the loop with Matt Genova before today on all of them, and because some of the numbers were not in line with what I had in my system, and that would imply that because I think the planning office and Matt, they kind of get together and they get their information directly out of our project info system, so they should have been the same. So there's a few of those that I'm investigating further, but I think in general most of my costs were in line with what we were thinking.
Thank you.
What's programmed?
Tom Bent.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much for such a detailed presentation. That really kind of spells out, where these costs are and what they are. The couple of questions on that is, listen to the discussion about Ferry Street and when these costs are actually applied. I'm a little confused. Is it a problem with the designers or the consultants that are putting these numbers together early on that they're not carrying those costs, and then it kind of escalates as we get from 25% to 50 or whatever? Because I know as an MPO member, I want to be making decisions on projects based on what we think that final cost is going to be. So these increases at the end are always tough to swallow, and especially if we've already committed to a project and then we find out we have, a large increase. So I think that's my main question. And I know you probably answered part of it, but I'm still a little confused on it. So if you could clear that up for me, that would be.
Sure. Let me answer two ways. The designers are not always carrying that cost, and they should be. Yeah. But within the design phase of the project, we have a series of checklists that are submitted at each design submittal. And it says, it basically lists out questions about the specifics of the design. Is the bridge included? Is the bridge super elevated? There's specifics. But as you get down to the end, it says there's a specific item. It says, is the project cost in line with the programmed amount on the tip?
Yep.
And that answer, if you don't answer yes, if it's answered no, then they have to put a response in, is it or isn't it? And then it has to be signed by a principal of the firm. So those are areas that we're going to have to scrutinize a little bit more, Tom. And it's a little, I don't want to say it's that they're not doing it everywhere. Some are, some aren't, I guess is the best way to answer that.
Okay, and then the other question that I had was, as the projects are being done, completed, are we tracking, say, your costs as to how well they ended up, how well the estimate came to the actual? So if you get like 5% for police, did it end up being 10%? Was it 3%? That type of thing. I'm just kind of curious because, I do this for a living too. And after a project's done, we kind of do a autopsy on it to see, what went right, what went wrong. So I'm kind of curious to see on these costs, because they're all based off of percentages on, I assume, dollar amount, so that you want to make sure your percentages are good. It's almost like, the 4% inflation piece that we have if a project goes into the next year. Is that 4% still a good number right now? Because I know certain things like copper and steel and things like that, lumber are going through the roof right now. So just some questions on that end.
John?
I'm sorry, I missed a couple of those. I missed the very beginning of that, Tom. I got till the end.
Yeah, I'll help you, John. So the question is, when we're done with when a project is done, do we go back and see whether our estimates were right for things like police and all the other add-ons, so that as we're doing the next round, we have the data point that says, okay, police is really more like 6% instead of 8%. Do we do that kind of, I think that's what Tom's asking, right? Do we do some continuous analysis to make sure that our numbers are right going forward as we're adding one for the next set of projects?
Yes, we actually are able with our system at the end of construction to do I don't have the information available with me right now, but we do at least do an assessment of the costs that have been applied. And then I check that with each of the district offices over the last 2 weeks before we were coming in today to make sure that the numbers that we're using are consistent with what our costs have been. And that stuff has been consistent, but it is something we check on an annual basis to see, as you said, did we need to be out in the field more for construction, or were there a lot of overruns, and why were there overruns? And traffic police is really is a difficult one for us to assess because we're not controlling that at all. When they're out in the field, they're doing the work. If the local police or state police say you need to have more officers out here for this reason because of congestion or because of for safety, then we err on the side of safety and we make sure there are more officers there to be able to to be able to handle this. So, but we are assessing it on a regular basis, and I can at least research that and provide some additional data in the very near future.
The second part was on the 4% increase that we tack on if a project goes into another year. Are we looking at that? Because again, right now, I know inflation on construction materials is pretty high.
That's actually a directive from Federal Highway Administration for our programming. And but we are tracking, where prices and where our materials and costs are increasing, so that we can be more informed while we're making these decisions.
Okay, thank you, John.
David Kozis.
Thank you, John, for this breakdown. Like the others, I guess I've always sort of thought all these years that when an office estimate first comes to the MPO with, with a cost and a request for programming, that it always already automatically, at least tries to include these contingencies and police details and utility costs. But now we know that that's not the case, and that these add-ons are not included some of the time, at least it seems. I think that it makes the cost estimate that we're presented with kind of meaningless in terms of comparing different projects. And so I'm not sure how we would know, when an office estimate is brought to us, which extra costs are included and which projects don't include them yet. So I'm wondering, maybe at the time of programming, as a requirement, of the MPO, that we should be requesting a more detailed breakdown, just like the one that we're seeing here, of what's included at that time, in the cost estimate, what's not included yet. And then maybe, especially early on, we'll have a better sense of, which projects would be, that we know for sure, would have a cost increase. I think I've never really seen this kind of detailed breakdown before, but I think it's very, very informative.
So, John?
Yes.
Let me ask you a question, because my understanding, like Ken's, is that every programmed amount in the tip includes the add-ons, right? Either the designer does the cost estimating and includes the add-ons, or we do an add-on before we program it in the tip. But every cost in the tip includes the add-ons, right? It includes the 10%.
Yes.
10% contingency. It includes our construction management costs. It includes an estimate for police, and it may or may not include a good estimate for utilities because it's a really, swag kind of estimate, right?
Right. Right.
So I really think there's a breakdown here between the consultant community, MassDOT, and the cities and towns, right? I think consultants are sometimes designing to the tip number without realizing, no, you can't design to the tip number. You've got to design to your original office estimate number. And if you can't, and you can't because costs go up and whatever, that's fine, but you should not be designing to the tip number. The tip number includes stuff that isn't reflected in your design costs.
Right.
John?
I agree with you, David, and I've gone back to my project managers on this, and as you said, when we get an estimate, we put it into our system, that estimate, and we identify where our challenges, where we have. But you're right, we need to do a better job with the communities and with the designers on the transparency, because as you know, when a project gets programmed at the very early phases, when a project goes through PRC, we essentially have a wish list at that point of this is what we'd like the project to be. And if we refer back to that number at all times, that number needs to include those add-ons, but it's a napkin sketch at this point. And I'm not criticizing this community or the designers. They look at it and they say, oh, this is what we need to do, et cetera. This is what we need to do for a corridor, for a traffic, for a bike path, or whatever the case may be. And, as I said, we need to do a better job on our side, working with the designers and the communities on those costs and making sure that it's clear, the number that they need to be designing towards.
Right. And
there are also add-ons that are, people do start to tend to design to the number, and that ends up being, then it's, now they need to factor in those add-ons, and they're not always done. Mayors and public works directors and counselors, et cetera, they're, oh, geez, we need to address this. We need to have, and I think Ken may have referenced, these elaborate lighting and treatments to the sidewalks and crosswalks and stuff. And those need to be factored into that cost as well.
Right, and now none of that answers David's point. The MPO should think about whether what David has suggested makes sense as our operating process, where when we have a city or town, or MassDOT for that matter, submit project costs, that they itemize them into office estimate and the other things that John showed on his sheet. I mean, we could still require that because it is a second check that the MPO itself could be doing. Next up is,
Could I add one other question to David's point?
Yeah, sure, John.
When we started working with some of the district officers on this when I first joined the highway division, and what we had heard from some of the smaller MPOs is that it was taking up their capacity to design projects because all of these extra costs were being applied, and they couldn't add, so they could only program 3 projects or 4 projects instead of 6. And so we're working through that so we can do better to inform the other smaller MPOs in the regions and make sure that we're getting their input and giving them our perspective. And, it's going to be a better chance that, some of the communities don't have this backlog, of projects to be able to draw from if something doesn't make a specific year. And then when they program it with some of those add-ons, project designs are not being advanced on some of those further, future projects. And then something's not going to make it because of some constraint. And now they're like, well, we can't get this ready and we're going to lose funds. And so it is a bit of a balance.
Lynn Diggins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I mean, that was all very interesting. I'm glad I went after Mr. Kozis because he was really getting at some of the things that I was thinking about. So, but before I say more, Mr. Chair, so what is the goal for this part of the conversation? Is it just exploratory on our part, or do we want to try to think about how we're going to change the way that we do things and formulate that?
The original goal for this was we had been asked to produce information so that people, as we're talking about the TIP programming, will have some information about where the cost estimates came from, what's included in them, why did the costs go up. It's verged a little beyond that, which is fine. I mean, it's a free-ranging discussion. At some point, we do have to, however, get back to our agenda because we do have to talk about programming the TIP and the work that Matt has done. But
okay, then I'll save my comments for later on. Yeah, I'll save my comments for later on. And so I respect that, and I have some ideas, but it'll be better later on. Thank you very much.
No worries. I'll try to call on you first when we're on the TIP item, then when we take time. Daniel Amstutz.
Hi, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much. I had some comments, but I think they've mostly been addressed by what John has said. I agree with what David Kozis was getting at, and I think during the discussion, I feel like there's I don't think I fully grasp. I don't know if everybody here fully grasps how the numbers actually sort of end up on the TIP. What that who's just sort of understanding how that's being vetted or how that's being verified, I guess, is because there seemed to be some discrepancy with what John was talking about and with what is on the TIP, and then also these contingencies and things that are supposed to be there but apparently aren't always there. So it just, I don't know, I don't quite understand sort of how you get from one place to the next. So helpful to explore that a bit more. My question is about Bedford and the Minuteman Bikeway extension. I don't think that was on the list that John had presented. Is there information? I think it was like a $4 million increase for that project, and I wonder if that's the same. Is it also these contingencies and things that are getting included in the price for that cost increase?
Where is that on the I'm sorry, where is that for a year on the STIP right now?
2023.
Okay, I looked at Matt's spreadsheet when I went through all this stuff, and I may have missed something. I will look into that. I can't open it right now, but I will look at that and get back to you before the end of the meeting. See if
Okay,
there's
thank
something
you.
that I'm not aware of.
Great, thank you.
Tom Katzis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be brief so we can move on. Yeah, the conversation morphed into other things and some really great points, like David's point, Daniel's point. Right away, the MPO staff know that we can communicate with the municipalities better, if nothing else, about the definition of cost. But I'm just going to throw in a companion piece, and then I'll run. Jim Fitzgerald and I have been thinking about this stuff, and it almost seems that after the functional design report is submitted, I hate to say it, but we've got to try to take advantage of the resources and the skills that the MassDOT project managers take, and maybe have a review of the initial document shortly afterwards to say, okay, is everybody on page? Because we look at that, but then we don't revisit it again for years. So I know it's another process. I know that resources are slim at all agencies, but how can we get the MassDOT project managers into looking at the design report after the work starts? In other words, to look at well, here's the design report. This is what we approved. They reviewed it, but now the rubber's meeting the road, and maybe before it goes too long, to have a review of it. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
You're welcome, Doug. Jim Fitzgerald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think Tom hit on some of my questions, which is how do we, get this expertise of the cost estimating in earlier, right, from the experts at MassDOT. But I think I just want to confirm what I think I just heard earlier, which is that let's theoretically call it, Project X comes in at 10 million to PRC, and at the PRC stage, these contingencies are added, right? And then the designer turns around and says, oh, we don't have 10 million, we've got 11.5, and then they take advantage of that contingency and design whatever extra materials or extra geography into the project, and then submit a 25% $11.5 million project that should only be 10 million, right? And then the contingency has to get added again. Is that what I just heard? Is part of the problem?
That's part of it, yes.
Gotcha. Okay, so that's a big problem, obviously, that I think is a little clearer now for all of us. But that's helpful. So I just go back to what Tom said. How do we get cost estimating expertise infused earlier on so that we're seeing as accurate of cost as possible while we're programming projects in the first place? So that's always seems like a consistent problem for us. So anyway, thank you.
Could I offer a response, Mr. Mola?
Of course, John.
To Tom and Jim's comment about the cost estimating, expertise. One item that I mentioned in the prior to getting into the specific project costs was some of the items that we're doing to get a better handle on this. And one of them is our pre-25% engineering directive. We're talking about scoping. We obviously, as you said, as you both said, you get a project from PRC. This is the amount, and it's kind of like it's not defined. It hasn't been cooked, hasn't been vetted, doesn't have public interest groups that are weighing in and said, oh no, you got to take care of this, you got to do that. So when we get a project approved through PRC within a time frame, and I think the directive, which is due to go out within 6 months of the project being approved, we want to have a pre-scoping, the pre-25% design scoping meeting with the community, with the designer, and there's a whole host of folks on the MassDOT side to basically scope the project, to take all the items that were in the project need form and the map it and the project initiation form and go through it. And we've done that as part of our ABP, Accelerated Bridge Program, and in the past. So now we've taken that information, that checklist of project design features, and we're incorporating it in all of our projects. Where our accelerated bridge program first went forward, we got to do this project, and here's what our cost is, and we would identify those constraints early on in the bridge phase. And what I've presented to this group, over the last several years is, when we did an assessment of like over 10,000, over 1,000, apologize, over 1,000 projects over the last, 10 years. And what the projects, we saw which types of projects were increasing in cost, in size, scope, and cost over that time. And the highest percentage was our roadway reconstruction program. And the ones that had, that were in the 25% range, increasing cost, increasing size and scope. Our bridge program was increasing by less than 10%. So over, as I said, over 1,000 projects reviewed over a 10-year time frame, and we found that the scoping sessions that we were doing with our bridges, obviously, a bridge limits are much more defined, but the costs were being controlled better because of the project limits. And we're applying some of those factors now to all of our programs, and that directive is going to the chief engineer this week. We've already sought input from our district offices, from FHWA, and internally from our highway designers, et cetera. And now it's going to the chief for final signature. And that's going to identify, that's going to put an SOP in place that says all projects within this time frame need to have a pre-25 scoping meeting with the community, with the designer, and representatives of MassDOT to basically scope out the project properly. And at that point, if there's a cost increase from what's been programmed, it's got to bubble up to me, the deputy chief engineer for project development, and consideration needs to be offered if the project needs to go back to PRC. And that's if, the project is programmed at $5 million and starting to go forward. And then once they get out there and they start looking at it and they put this team together and they review it, and they say, oh, yeah, this project scope needs to include this, this, and this, and all of a sudden $5 million becomes $10 million, then there are criteria in there, which we've heard from others who have presented to this group, Build America and others, that say, hey, when the project increases by this amount, it really needs to be reevaluated, and it's got to get kicked up to me and to the chief engineer and maybe get bounced back to Project Review Committee, PRC, for assessment and say, where is this project, and we talked about this a couple weeks ago about, I want to say, the Norwood project that went from 9 million or 10 million to 25 million. And there was discussion, well, when it was a $10 million project, it was, it was fundable and it was a viable project. Now it's 25. Should we be re-looking at it, and what are the benefits we're getting for a $25 million project at this location, or has the scope increased, and is it justifiable? So we are introducing that as part of our design process, so we can get a better handle on costs early on and scoping early on. And if it does trigger some of those thresholds, and it gets bubbled up to me and back to PRC for reassessment.
Thank you, John. So
Thank
we have to finish this item, but I've got two members of the public who have had their hands up for a while, so I'm going to call on them, and then we're going to move on. Tom Brennan.
Hi, Tom Brennan. I'm Alternative Transportation Group out in Framingham. I served for many years as vice chair on the Bike and Pedestrian Committee in Framingham, and as vice chair on the Cochitiot Rail Trail Committee. And I have two questions, and they seem to relate to a lot of projects that we've either looked at or worked on in the past. First is there's a policy about projects going through some of the state DOT funding. There are things where, for example, on the Cochitiot Rail Trail, our initial concepts or designs started to work in elements that had some kind of what was interpreted as and they were recreational aspects. And so you'd see things like the benches we were planning to put along the path as stopping points for people that were walking and were getting along in age or just slower, and a little viewing platform we wanted to put in for the marshland for the birds. And these parts of the projects were considered recreational aspects. And so the transportation funding is targeted in such a way it's fairly inflexible about not allowing those, and even are trying to attempt to allow stubs for those parts of the project. We were requested to kind of clip those out. There's a rigidity about it that could be better preserved. And the other question I have, I'll go ahead and tack it on now, and you can skip or answer which both if you like. There seems to be more of a tangle at the initiation of projects. This kind of, we can't do the planning until we have the right of way. We can't get funding for the right of way until we have the planning in place. Design work is priced out towards the total project price. So it can be a very expensive thing for the communities to commit to until they have the right of way. And yet the trying to get funding for the right of way can be enhanced by having the design aspects at least partially done up front. That it's kind of a catch-22. And I know we can't be the only community, or certainly there are several projects I've seen get kind of tangled up in their own feet at the beginning, and it adds time and expense, and it drags everything out at the start, where better guidance up front would be helpful. I don't know if there's some way we can help to enable that a little better at the beginning. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you. Ben Cares?
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to the Boston MPO staff for putting together this presentation. Specifically, Mr. Burchard, this has been extremely helpful for the city of Chelsea to take a look at sort of what our delta is, and try to sort of go back with our design group to investigate sort of where are these increases coming from. And I think that, and I'll keep this brief because I know we need to move on, but I do think that a lot of the sentiments and sort of strategies that have been shared that are specifically targeting that 25% design and estimate sort of inflection point of projects. And I know that, Tom, you just recently sort of mentioned this, that immediate intervention there and really scoping the project and sort of being transparent about the prospect of maybe it going back before PRC. I think, you know, sort of getting in there and sort of sitting down with the municipalities and their design groups can be extremely helpful, a little bit more forthcoming, and can help to sort of allay some of these issues that we've been seeing for, you know, the past few or, you know, years that we've been programming these larger projects. So I want to thank you and everybody else that's sort of considering those strategies moving forward. I think it'll certainly improve sort of the deficits that we're facing between, you know, especially that 25% to 75% estimate. And then also, Mr. Burchard, I also saw that on the presentation, it's 10.3 million to 13.3 million for Chelsea. That gap is actually a little bit shorter than is shown here after we revisited the design estimates with our design group. So that'll be forthcoming in the 100% design package in April. We did communicate that to the project managers at Mass DOT. So hopefully that information will come your way. And yeah, looking at sort of some of these contingencies for overruns, construction engineering, traffic police, incorporating those earlier on and sort of not using those to back out increasing the design cost is a very, you know, it's a golden piece of information for us to sort of avoid these issues in the future. So I appreciate all of the sentiments shared today. And I think that as we move forward through the, you know, an iterative process that will never be not an iterative process, we'll close this gap further and further. So thank you, everybody, for your time on this.
Thank you, Stuart. All right, put the regular agenda back up, please. Next item on the agenda is public comments. Is there anyone from the public who would like to comment at this time? So please raise your hand. Matthew Peterson.
Hello. Yeah, so I'm the big surprise. I'm actually commenting related to some of the earlier information we just heard.
I'll be quick because I know that there's lots of other things on the agenda, but it's unclear to me how, as just a member of the public, that how costs can be contained if the MPO is going to commit to cover all cost increases for projects that it is committed to. At some point, the MPO has to be clear that costs above a certain degree of contingency will not be covered because that inhibits its ability to meet the transportation needs of the region. The MPO distributes a lot of funds in the Boston region. You know, if the MPO is able to set more cost discipline in its policy, then this could have an influence on project cost discipline across the region because the MPO distributes a ton of money in the region. And if the MPO kind of is in the position of committing to cover all cost increases going forward in the future, then there's no incentive for a project to limit its scope or to limit its costs because they just know that the MPO is going to back up their cost increase, even if that means that the MPO is not able to fund any projects in the next fiscal year. It's a matter of meeting our regional transportation needs, and if we can't fund the needs of the region because the existing projects have already taken up all the budget for like the next 5 years, then how can that be an acceptable state of affairs, I guess, to me as just someone who's like just listening in. And additionally, you know, I think that means that we need to kind of change our, as a lot of people have said, change our policies for cost estimates and the coverage of cost increases. But it also is like, I think project oversight could really be improved. And this is something that John Bouchard, I think, touched on, so that at all stages of the planning, funding, and delivery processes, the estimates are real, the scope is controlled so that these project commitments can be met. I mean, essentially, when the MPO makes a funding commitment, it's committing to the community that this transportation improvement will be created and will deliver real benefits for the people living in the Boston region. And I think when cost estimates are wrong, when scope creep expands project costs, when delivery deadlines get pushed because of, project additions that increase the cost and complexity of a project, that means that it's more difficult to meet those commitments to the public. And, whether that means it's more massed up project management oversight, as I think John said, or whether that's like, some brand new like CTPS thing to handle like it on the MPO side. But I think project oversight could really be improved so that you don't have these kinds of surprises coming up where, oh, suddenly a contingency is all taken up because now it covers the sidewalks too. We're like, oh, these utilities were so big. And so now this thing covers like, 2 miles of sewer replacement. So I think that that's a big thing. I also think that like, I think the person from Chelsea, I'm sorry, I forgot the name, said that I think more, and maybe also I think Tom Branham from Framingham also said that more technical assistance earlier in the process could be helpful as well, because if you have all these municipalities who maybe don't have all the money to fund all their high-zoot design work, if they're trying to just get an estimate out the door so they can get the 25% in and get a project on the tip, it's really hard for them to maybe do all the in-depth estimates and deep design work because that's expensive. So if I don't know whether that's a MassDOT program could be, or something that the MPO should push the state to do, or whether this is something where CTPS could hire people to fill that gap, but I think having more technical design assistance earlier on so that when these things come to the table, that they're in a better, more accurate cost estimated position with a more clearly defined scope. I think that seems like it would also be really helpful for the MPO's kind of funding debacle. But thanks for the opportunity to comment.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Next up is Marzi Galaska.
Good morning, Chairman Mola and MPO members. As you discuss the budget issues right now, I also wanted to take the opportunity to provide some comments about the Swampscott Rail Trail. It's project number 610666. Obviously, my name is Marzi Galaska. I'm the director for the Office of Community and Economic Development, as well as a Swampscott resident. And I am here this morning to respectfully request that you program the Swampscott Rail Trail in the next tip that you will be discussing shortly. This project is seeking TIP funding to construct a 2-mile multi-use trail that will benefit and connect our neighborhoods with school and the recreation areas within the area. The Swampscott Trail will also connect the Bike to the Sea to the Marblehead, as well as the Salem community path. The town of Swampscott, including our elected officials, our land use boards, residents, are fully supportive of this project. Funding for the design has been secured. In 2017, town meeting allocated $850,000 for design and engineering. To date, we have retained the services of Stantec Engineering to begin the design. The design is ongoing, and we plan to submit a 25% design to MassDOT by the end of the month. As I have stated, we have the funds as well as the staff to complete 100% of the design, address environmental compliance, right-of-way acquisitions, and advance the developments of plan specifications and estimates for this project. The benefits and the beneficiaries of this project are many, and now more than ever, we need to create an alternative modes of transportation and create spaces and places that would allow our residents of the region and the residents of Swampscott alternative options to recreation as well as commuting. As I stated, the town is committed to this project and is prepared to do all that is necessary to complete the design and expedite this project. I respectfully request that you include this project in the 22-26 tip. Thank you.
Allison Burson.
Good morning. I am Allison Burson from the Solomon Foundation, and we are a foundation that supports access to parks and greenways in the greater Boston area and increasingly in the whole state of Massachusetts. So being able to hear this morning all this conversation about design funding and process is actually super helpful to us. And I'm so glad this conversation is happening because we're always asking, with our small number of private dollars and philanthropic dollars, how can we help seed more really important active transportation projects in the state, and which is why I'm here today to follow up after Marzi to speak on behalf of the Swampscott Rail Trail. And this is a project that we provided a little bit of seed money to help support construction of the first block to show residents, how wonderful this amenity is. And it's, I want to underscore, as Marzi said, how it's both very important as a local benefit and for local active transportation and mobility, but it's also really, really important regional link. It extends the Greenway connection from the Northern Strand and Everett, Revere, Malden, Chelsea, and Lynn to Greenway and Marblehead, Salem, and Peabody. So really connecting all of our northern communities. And then it's also, it's part of the East Coast Greenway, so a protected national route. So for all those reasons, echoing Marzi, that really encouraging support and funding for this project. Thank you.
Mayor McGee.
Thank you, Chairman Moeller, and to the members of the MPO. I have some comments on a couple of projects, but I've been listening to the discussion over the last hour or so, and I'll put on a hat that I used to wear in terms of being in the Senate, chairman of the Senate Transportation Committee, and the need for dollars for investment in infrastructure, both at the federal and state level, couldn't be more clear than the discussion we just had in terms of what the needs are and what we need to do. And I continue to advocate, from my perspective, on an investment in infrastructure, and hopefully the federal government will do so. Clearly, the needs of the Commonwealth, the needs of the communities are well beyond the dollars that are available, and it's a challenging job at the MPO to make those decisions. So I appreciate the work you do every day to try and put the dollars that are available and make them work for all of the communities. Project on Linfield Street, Route 109, project 602077 is a full reconstruction of Linfield Street, Route 129. This project is currently programmed for FY 2022, but is under consideration to move to FY 2023. This includes a complete reconstruction of approximately 1 mile of the roadway to include complete street elements, safety improvements for all users throughout that corridor. I thank the board for supporting this project and the partnership that various MDOT groups have shown in moving this project through the design process. I respectfully request the MPO board keep the project in the current program year, as we are confident we'll be able to continue to meet the design phases and the milestones necessary to begin this project in FY 2022. Remain on target to meet our scheduled advertisement date of March 2022, with plenty of time remaining in the fiscal year to comfortably meet our project obligations. Some of the updates that will help demonstrate our ability to continue to advance this project in a timely manner and our commitment to this project for the benefit of the community and the region. 25% public hearing was held last October. No major issues were raised by the public. We have addressed those 25% comments and will submit a 75% plan as scheduled by the end of this month. In anticipation of moving forward with our current project schedule, we begun title work and engaged an appraiser and continue to actively coordinate with the MassDOT right-of-way group to proactively address any concerns to stay on target. Funds will be in place to complete the work by fall of 2021, the right-of-way work. We have been and continue to work to permit preliminary utility works to complete in advance of the advertisement date. I just want to thank the board again for this project. Request that this project remain on the FY 2022. We're working aggressively and will continue to work aggressively to meet the expected advertisement date of March 2022 and construction to begin in spring 2022. We're working hard to make that, and that's a top priority for us. Two other projects one is on the tip for 2024, the reconstruction of Essex Street, number 609252, scored 66, the highest score of complete streets in that category for the 2024 tip. The limits are Essex Street beginning at its intersection and Rockaway Street, running along from Eastern Ave Route 129, a large stretch, 6,100 linear feet, 1.1 miles along that really important stretch through that center of our community. It's the two of the top 200 crash locations are on that corridor, as well as 4 HSIP clusters. Funds have been appropriated for the project from our end, and we're committed to this project. 25% design is submission scheduled on fall of 2021. Survey and plan preparation are complete. Topographical survey, conceptual plan development is complete. 25% design phase is underway. Pre-design meeting for MassDOT, World Tech, and the city is this Monday, March 8th. Community leaders will be making plans for the community meetings will be planned April, May, timeframe and continue throughout. The scheduled ad date is February 2024. The city fully understands our responsibility for the design, right-of-way, and regulatory permitting for the projects. We're committed to this obligation. We'll provide the support necessary at our level, my level, to ensure the state and federal design requirements are met. Our consultant team will continue to work with community leaders, MassDOT, and the MPO to advance this project expeditiously. And I just want to reaffirm our commitment that this is a top priority for us, and we're committed to advancing with our own dollars this project. That is a $16.9 million project. And finally, at the reconstruction of Western Avenue, which is a key piece for the region. It sits between the investment being made in the Salem corridor of Route 107 with a connection to Revere on the other side. It's a direct connection from Boston through to Salem. Project is $36.2 million. It's not programmed. It did receive the 76 score, highest score of projects in the complete street category on the TIP evaluation. It was originally at 60 score, still remains the highest score, an additional points of 16.6, which got us to the 70.69 total. That corridor will run the extension of Western Ave, Route 107, from almost the Lynn line, 10,800 square linear feet, 2 miles, up to all along that corridor, which is numerous intersections, major intersections, for a total of, with some of those intersections, 24,000 linear feet, 4.6 miles of work. 4 of the top 200 locations of high crash locations on that 2-mile stretch, 9 HSIP clusters. Funds are being appropriated for the project from the city side. Survey and prep is being finalized. A plan and development is underway. Community meetings are being planned April of May and continue throughout. We're also anticipate pre-25% design meetings in June and July of this year. We know that we're responsible for this as a major investment from the city side, but just as importantly, this is a major investment for the region and the corridor. We are taking on a stretch that will really complement a major investment on the other side of the Lynn-Salem line on the Route 107 corridor. So we are willing to take that on, particularly with our investment of the percentage we will pay from the city side to take this on. So I want to put that on and would request that there's a consideration for that being on the 2026 tip as part of a regional corridor that has been a major focal point for DOT for a number of years and will continue. Again, thank you very much. Look forward to supporting the work that goes on at the MPO. And I want to thank you all for the work you do to keep getting these dollars out to the communities around this region that need the investment for the economic opportunity and growth that depends on these investments. Thank you. If there's any questions, my team's on the phone to answer any questions as well.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Next up, Councilor Winslow from Walden.
Hello, yes, I just wanted to talk today. I know there's the Community Connections grants that are up for 2022. And I know there's Malden's involved with a couple of those. One through the MBTA for traffic signal prioritization along Salem Street. So strong support to work to improve our traffic signals in Malden. We have very many antiquated signals. Then we also work for the city of Medford to on a blue community connections grant related to extending the Blue Bikes program out to our community. So wanted to speak in support of that as well. And it's great to see Lynn and Swampscott projects, and particularly complete streets and trail projects that will all connect eventually into Malden through the Northern Strand Trail. So so very supportive of that. But that's I just wanted to make those comments in favor of those community connections projects. And hopefully Malden will be getting involved in the tips soon. So thanks. Great. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Emily Teller.
Thank you so much for letting me speak and for letting everybody speak this morning and for the presentation. I'm representing the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail. I'm secretary of the Friends Group, and I just wanted to say two things now, and I might have another thing to say when it comes up for discussion, if it does. But I'm not trying to tell you how to do your work, obviously, but I hope that any 2021 projects that are not being funded could be expended and transferred to the 2022 fiscal year. And also, a year ago, I attended an MPO meeting and took notes, and I didn't see anything then about the Chapter 91 license concerns, and that was before the 25% design public hearing. And at that time, Beth Sudemeyer from Sudbury requested that any outstanding items or needed information be addressed then. And I guess I would just like to have a commitment from Mass Highway or Mass DOT or Mass MPO, the MPO, that the Chapter 91 licensing issue will not be a delay at this point for progressing to the funding in the 2022 year for the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail Phase 2 in Concord and Sudbury. Thank you.
You're welcome. Beth Sudemeyer.
Yes, thank you, Chairman Mueller, and good morning to everyone. We appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak on behalf of the project, the Sudbury and Concord Bruce Freeman Rail Trail Project, Phase 2D. It's project number 608461. I think I might have gotten that mixed up. I apologize. But I did want to take an opportunity and just provide an update from where we were at the last MPO meeting. And the town really appreciates the opportunity to have worked with Mass DOT to come to a greater understanding of the concerns that they were identifying, and to allow our project team to clarify where we're at with the design process and the schedule. And I believe that we've come to a mutual agreement that we all are confident that the project can be delivered in fiscal year 2022. As was just mentioned, that Chapter 91 permit, we certainly recognize that that is a Mass DEP issued permit, and the timeline for review for that is out of the control of Mass DOT, but we feel that our schedule has adequately accommodated that review period if that permit is required, and we're getting a determination on that in the very near future in coordination with Mass DEP. So we feel very confident about the progress that we have been able to make and the schedule that we've presented, and are very happy to hear that Mass DOT is also supportive of that. And again, thank you to DOT and the MPO for your continued support of the project, and we look forward to advancing it.
Thank you. David
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and everyone, for the opportunity to speak to the City of Salem's request for funding for the Sailor Skipper microtransit program. This is a service that is up and running already, as I note in the comment letter I submitted, which I hope you all had a chance to look at. The service started this past December with partial funding from a MassDOT Workforce Transit Grant. We're seeing a very good ridership since the end of February. We've provided about 3,000 trips with the service, and we're also seeing a lot of those trips are shared trips. About 10% of those trips. We're seeing our users who are on their way to their destination, additional passengers are being picked up. In addition, the booking service allows folks to do a +1. So we're seeing about 8% of trips being made with more than one person. So we definitely think that this is a service, given the ongoing pandemic, is certainly still growing, and we hope that you support continuing funding this so that we can make it as robust and sustainable as possible. And as I note in my letter, I'm happy to answer any more questions as we move forward with utilization and as you continue your review process. Thank you.
Thank you. Rich Benavindo?
Good morning and thank you. Gee, while I was listening to the previous discussion, I had several comments that I was going to make, but I'll hold those just in the interest of time. But did want to bring up a couple of projects. First and foremost, Mayor McGee did a great job in explaining the status of the projects in Lynn, so I won't go into those. I did want to talk about Peabody and Central Street, 608-933. That project is advancing quite rapidly. I know that the Deputy Chief Bouchard, when he put up the cost estimate for that project, although the project is slightly over, it wasn't at that 15 million. The office estimate was actually 10.2. I think it showed the office estimate at 12.1. That included $2 million of non-participating work. So the participating work is actually 10.2. The total estimate was 12.1. So when you put all the additional contingencies and so forth, it actually gets it to 12.77. So it's still a little bit over. The design team will be working to try and do some value engineering to get those costs down. We're very much aware that these costs need to be added on. Deputy Chief Bouchard and I are on a stakeholder partnering group, so we are going to be working with the stakeholder group to have these actually part of the estimate. So when you're submitting that estimate, those numbers and percentages are actually on the estimate, so they're calculated at each design phase submission. Do just a little update on Peabody. It's on the FY23 tip. It has a scheduled add date of 12/17/22. Preliminary design was submitted. We got comments back. We were waiting for some additional comments on right-of-way, which we just received. So those will be addressed. We're anticipating that the design public hearing will be sometime in May. So the project is advancing quickly. Actually, May 6th for the design public hearing. So just want to make sure that that remains front and center. Within the FY23 tip year, this project scored the highest in the complete streets category. So it's a priority project, not only for the city, but for the region. Anyone on the North Shore knows where Central Street is and knows how valuable that is to the region. So just wanted to give a quick update, and we will be in correspondence with Mass DOT in terms of the estimate. And our design team here as the consultant is also aware of these things. And we'll be trying to, as I mentioned, value engineer these things down so that we can meet these programmed amounts. There are other streets. We already talked about Ferry Street and so on and so forth, so I won't get into those. And if they come up later on during further into today's agenda, I'll be available to answer questions as well. So thank you.
Thank you. Ben Kears?
Good morning again. I'll keep this very brief. I just wanted to continue the update on Upper Broadway outside of the cost estimate increase, which I mentioned would be forthcoming with some of the design estimates being tapered down. We have started our right-of-way process with Upper Broadway. We have an appraisal services team on contract. They've already sent out their communications. We've also sent all of our communications out from the city's perspective, and we have had some successful donations of temporary easements, and then some good, meaningful conversations around some of the permanent and temporary easements themselves. So that process will take us through a good chunk of the summer, and then we'll be well positioned to be ready for our add date that we're shooting for in December of 2021. Additionally, we have another TIP project that we recently submitted before the board, which is for Purlin Park Street. For those of you that are familiar with Chelsea, we're doing a lot of work along Upper Broadway, downtown Broadway. This project would be extremely complementary to a lot of the efforts we're doing there, especially from a transit asset standpoint. A lot of MBTA key bus routes move through the area. And then we're also bridging that together with some utility reconstruction efforts. So going about it in a very holistic fashion and sort of tying up all the buttons with the surface improvements. So we hope that the board will consider that project, as it did score highly amongst others. And I just wanted to give those two brief updates, and that is it for me.
Thank you. Brendan Callahan.
Hi there, Brendan Callahan with the City of Peabody. Just want to kind of give a project update on two of the Bikeway projects that we have on the tip for FY24 and FY25. The FY24 project for the Peabody Independence Greenway extension, we've been in a back and forth at MassDOT with comments over the last several months. We've now gotten the green light to proceed with sketch plans and to submit our 25% design plans. That will be submitted on April 16th of 2021. So that project's been moving forward, and we anticipate a construction on schedule construction advertised date in April of 2023. With regards to our other Bikeway project, the multi-use path at I-95 and Route 1, we did hire a consultant in the fall of last year, and we have begun starting with the survey work right away and working on the right-of-way plans. And so that project's been moving forward. We have secured funding for both projects for the design for both projects. So the city, again, we're in position to just continue the project forward and meet all the anticipated scheduled milestones. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Todd Blake.
Hi, Todd Blake, City of Medford. I just wanted to, ask for your consideration for our Community Connections grant application with Medford and Malden, as Councilor Winslow already spoke to. Medford and Malden, Medford specifically, is very excited about this, adding bike share to Medford and increasing bicycle mode share in Medford and extending the already great system in our neighboring cities and towns. So we really appreciate any support on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Matt Archer, I believe there's somebody in the chat who couldn't raise their hand and submit a chat question. Is that right? Or comment?
Yep, that is correct. I believe this actually may be related to the upcoming work scope. So if you'd like, I can hold off until Jipeng has presented.
Okay.
All right, sounds good. Although I will say that Jennifer Honig had to leave the meeting, but she did support the Swampscott Rail Trail. So I'll shut up now.
Thank you, Matt. I believe that's all. Although Emily, your hand is still raised. Did you have a second comment, or did you? Oh, now Sophia Gallimore, I'm sorry.
Hi, my name is Sophia Gallimore, and I'm representing the Watertown Transportation Management Association in Watertown, along with the town of Watertown. We do have a project that we have submitted for shuttle services. It's titled Pleasant Street Shuttle. And we were awarded the grant from the Transportation Workforce Program funding. However, a sizable amount of that funding was removed from the project. So we are applying for the Community Connections Grant Program. This is a shuttle service that has been needed in Watertown for quite some time due to the limited mass transit that's provided in the area. A lot of the senior citizens would have an opportunity to start riding a portion of this shuttle service into Watertown Square, as well as over to Harvard Square. So we definitely would like for you all to consider this project. We already have 2 major supporters, and we will be looking to have 2 additional supporters adding on this year. So we definitely would like for the project to be considered. Thank you.
Thank you. Lisa DiRocco.
My name's Lisa DiRocco, and I'm with the Medford Bicycle Advisory Commission, and just wanted to also respectfully request your consideration for the community connection to help us with the support the Blue Bike expansion into Medford. We are a great, it's a great way to connect the already successful bike share bikes in other Medford and Malden, connecting Somerville, Arlington, and Cambridge, etc. It would also be a great addition to our Medford bicycle master plan to make sure people are really comfortable riding bikes and making it accessible to the public. It also would be a great way to lead to improved transportation equity within our community. And you know, we were involved in the Lime Bike share program, but we believe that the dock-based bike system would be much more used in the community. So thanks very much.
Thank you. Phil Limnios.
Thank you very much, sir. And thank you very much for members of the committee. I just want to give a brief update on our Atlantic Ave job. We just recently contracted with ACOM Services to manage all of the right-of-way process, and that's underway. We are also working with Mass DOT on our MEPA progress, and we expect to meet our deadlines on the project. And we want to again thank the committee for funding this project and moving it along. So we seem to be on track. So thank you, sir.
Thank you. Rich Benevento.
Yeah, sorry, Mr. Chairman, I forgot one. And the discussion on Watertown just brought it up. And so I just wanted to bring up the Mount Auburn Street project. You may recall that at the last meeting, I did give a report on that. We had been waiting on comments from the MBTA, which were received, and we are in the process of responding to those comments. We also are responding to the design justification workbook comments, which should be submitted next week. And there's actually a utility site walk with Mass DOT on March 23rd. With this particular project, we were supposed to have the design public hearing last August. The design public hearing is now scheduled for this May. And again, it was just working out some of the details with the MBTA. The project is currently scheduled on the FY22 tip. And in conversations with the town and Mass DOT, et cetera, it's probably more appropriate to move that project to 23. Right now we have a current add date would be February 4th of 23. So it would be in that second quarter. So as the MPO is trying to juggle projects and move things around, that may be something that may help. Certainly the town would not want to lose its placement on the tip, but would be willing to push it out a year. And again, the difference between one fiscal year and another, you know, if a project's advertised in the fall versus it's advertised in the spring, it's still a spring or a summer construction start date. So, but just in terms of your deliberations and having to juggle funding, this actually may be a help and would be more appropriate given some of the delays that the project has had. So I just wanted to bring that up. When we get to that point, happy to discuss that further. Thank you.
Thank you. Seeing no other comments at this time, if you have a comment later in the meeting, raise your hand and we will try to call on you. I inadvertently skipped the executive director's report, so we're going to go back one in the agenda. Tegan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, I just wanted to thank everybody, everyone in the public and all the board members for being here today for this very important, although very long meeting. And I hope you can bear with me through just a couple of updates. First of all, in terms of outreach updates, In addition to the comments that you've been hearing here today and at the last meeting, we have received an additional, I believe the current number is 14 written comments on 6 different projects, and we will share those with you all as MPO board members shortly. So keep an eye out for that, please. And then I just wanted to touch on a recent event. Thank you to those of you who joined us for the Travel Demand Management in a Post-COVID World Forum that we co-hosted with MPC. And if you wanted to see it or you weren't able to attend and you'd like to see it, then the video of the forum is actually available on the Boston Region MPO YouTube channel. And it is linked to as well in the MPO meeting calendar. So please take a look. And then we wanted to share one also final reminder to please take the MPO elections process survey. Particular those of you who are board members, please do respond. And if you haven't already, please also encourage others in your region who may not be directly represented on the board to also respond. And then upcoming, please save the date for the next transit working group meeting, which will be on March 19th. And you'll be getting more information on that from us soon. So for today, in addition to the action items related to the scope and the TIP Amendment 3, as David said, we'll start to focus on your input on how you want to address the cost and readiness updates on this current TIP, which is the FY21 to federal fiscal year 25, so that we can come back to you in subsequent meetings to show you scenarios that capture that input and give you more sort of visuals for deliberation. In addition, we posted descriptions of newly evaluated projects, which could be considered in the federal fiscal years 22 to 26 TIP if there is funding available. And I just want to highlight for board members that those projects were scored using the new TIP evaluation criteria, whereas the projects that are on the 21 to 25 TIP, the one that was approved last year, but we are still discussing today, those were evaluated using the prior TIP criteria. So just something to keep in mind. And the scoring details for the new projects will be presented more fully at the next MPO meeting. And speaking of that, we'd like to have our next MPO meeting on the 18th of March, but also hold the date for an additional MPO meeting on the 25th of March. On the 18th, we'll expect to discuss the broader capital planning process, including projects that have been selected by Mass DOT, the MBTA, and RTAs that you as board members approve because they are using federal funds. They go through the prioritization process, but then you sort of are able to sort of discuss those projects before you vote to approve them. And then at the following meeting on the 25th, we will hope to be asking you to select a final scenario for the 22 to 26 TIP funding. So I hope that kind of lays out the process for you. Matt will also talk about it a little bit more during his presentation. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'm happy to take any questions or move along in the agenda.
Thanks, Tegan. Any questions for Tegan? Seeing none. Next item on the agenda is the committee chair's report. I believe we had a UPWP committee meeting, didn't we? Or did we not?
Yes, we did. Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's Ben Muller, the chair of the UPWP committee with MassDOT Planning. We met this morning, had a pretty good discussion on cross-boundary coordination and on some minor changes to the upcoming UPWP document. And we also had a little preview of the universe of UPWP studies for the federal fiscal year 2022 TIP or UPWP that'll kick off in October. So we scheduled our next meeting where we'll go into more depth on the universe of potential studies for the March 25th before the MPO meeting at 9 a.m. So if you want a little preview or you want to add to that discussion, we welcome anyone to attend. Thanks.
Thank you, Ben. Any questions for Ben? Seeing none, next item on the agenda. Lynn?
Sorry about that. I was having unmute issues. So we have not had a meeting since our last meeting, but our upcoming meeting on the 10th will feature Matt Genova and talking more about the TIP and Sandy Johnson, who will give us an introduction to the proto-universe. And I just want to express some appreciation to Michelle Scott and Jonathan Church, who got back to me regarding the strategic highway safety plan, and to Paul Christner and Blake Acton, who surprisingly, I wasn't expecting it, got back to me about concerns, questions about access to the Central Business District study. So I really appreciate that. It's been very helpful. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Next item on the agenda is a work scope on improving the pedestrian environment variables in travel demand model. J-Ping Lee, whenever you're ready, and Marty Milkovitz.
Good morning, everyone. My name is J-Ping Lee. I'm a transportation analyst working for the Boston MPO. I'm going to present the work program, Pedestrian Environment Variables in Travel Demand Model. This is a small discrete study approved through the UPWP process. We are now here to talk about how that work will be carried out. I'm going to follow the outline covering the background, the objectives, task, duration, and the budget of the work program. Here's some background of the program. The pedestrian environment variable is important for understanding the travel demand modeling. The purpose of the travel demand model, the pedestrian environment includes all non-motorized travelers, people walking, jogging, using wheelchairs, and biking. Because the pedestrian environment variables have impact on all non-motorized trips in the mode choice, as well as on auto ownership rates. So they are very important to be included in the modeling process. The current pedestrian environment variable is calculated using the roadways included in the model networks. However, the model networks don't represent local roads very well. The PEV calculation should use the roadway system with local roads well represented. The road inventory files collect the roadway system information with well represented local roads with all the attributes such as surface width, sidewalk width, and the shoulder width, number of travel lines, and the sidewalk presence. Several other built environment attributes not represented by the current PEV measures, such as parks and recreational space, bike lanes and cycle tracks, land use mix, and density. Because of these reasons, we propose to improve the current PEV metric. There are three objectives of the proposed PEV work program. Firstly, represent details of the built environment across the region. Secondly, understand the correlation between the current PEV and the walking and biking travel behavior. Thirdly, formulate the new PEV as a single metric or set of metrics. Three tasks were identified to achieve the objectives. Update and analyze the existing PEV metric. CTPS will calculate the current PEV metric using the latest road inventory data. The second task is to evaluate the biases and the limitations of the existing PEV formulation. CTPS will compare the resulting PEV to the pedestrian behavior observed from the recent household survey and other available walking, biking behaviors. The third task is to identify feasible enhancements to the current PEV. CTPS will examine the potential built-in environment variables and test the correlation to the limitations of the current PEV to explain pedestrian and bicycling activities. The duration of the project will last for about 4 months. And the total budget is $25,000. Thank you for listening to my presentation. Before I open it up for member questions and discussion, I want to thank Abby Swan for the comments she submitted on the PEV program. Her comment is posted on the MPO meeting calendar, and the board members can read the full text here. Ms. Swan, representing the Greater Boston chapter for the United Spinal Association, encouraged us to explicitly mention the users of wheelchairs and other assistive mobility devices as pedestrians in describing the PEV metric. To improve the consideration of wheelchair use in level of service and the sidewalk infrastructure variables, and to integrate the perspective of people who use wheelchairs in the new PEV metric this study proposes to establish. I want to thank Ms. Swan for her thoughtful comment and say that we are working to improve our consideration of the need of people with disabilities across all of our programs and projects. When it comes to travel demand modeling, we do have limitations incorporating pedestrian environment variables and representing roadway attributes that might be specific to wheelchair users. However, we are always working to improve our off-model tools. For example, the pedestrian report card assessment tool developed by CTPS staff can be used to gather data about the quality of pedestrian travel environment at specific locations. We want to continue the conversation with Ms. Swan about ways to improve the data we have and what can be modeled. We would be happy to talk more offline about her concerns. Thank you for letting me present. I'm letting the chair, Mr. Muller, to take additional questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, JP. Questions, Brian Kane?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just going to say that this is very important work, making sure that folks in wheel mobility devices and those that might need a little extra assistance are properly accounted for. And if you'll accept the motion, I would move acceptance, Mr. Chairman.
Well, first I want to let Lynn Diggins ask his question, then we'll come back to you. Lynn Diggins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will be happy to second it, although I realize that you haven't let it pass. I also agree about the comment on the wheelchairs. I have a couple of questions. First, my understanding is that in sidewalks, we don't really have a good inventory of our sidewalks. Is that going to be a factor in how you approach the modeling?
Oh, hi, Mr. Diggins. Thank you for your questions.
Sure.
Yeah, the sidewalk, that's a good question. Yeah, the sidewalk is a variable even in the current PV. we want to use the road inventory data because it's representing the local roads much better than the model network. And the things is the road inventory data, the quality, I mean the accuracy, we are not sure about that now, but we are trying to get a better quality of data. What I learned, we are going to have the 2020 road inventory file next week sometime.
All right, thanks. And something I didn't see when I read, and it might be helpful in terms of maybe testing the modeling, is I know that we have the Safe Routes to School initiative. So it might be interesting to see how that might factor in to pedestrian usage. That's not the right term, but hopefully you get a sense of what I mean by that. So that's more of a comment. And the last thing is I didn't notice a report back to us about this study, because I find this study fascinating, and I really would like to find out, well, not study, but this approach, this improvement in modeling, fascinating. So I'd love to find out what you decide to do. So I don't know if it's appropriate for you to report back to us. I mean, think about it. Otherwise, I'll track it down. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Diggins. Yeah, we definitely, we talk about this, more after offline. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Tom Branham, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, first, her volume is really low, so it's made it really hard to hear, but it's particularly bad because I'm kind of a technical kind of guy, and I'm very interested in systems and modeling. So I was wondering if the application of the PEV was, are you able to do something like point-to-point Monte Carlo simulations? And if you've done anything in Medallic, I'd be particularly interested to see that code be made available. Thank you.
You're welcome. So motion having been made by Brian Kane and seconded by Lynn Diggins. Oh wait, I should also note that the comment that Matt Archer received in the chat room was substantially the same as a comment that the same person made in their written comments. So we won't take the time to read it out loud a second time. Motion having been made by Brian Kane and seconded by Lynn Diggins. Jonathan, please call the roll.
David Moeller.
Yes.
John Bouchard. John Romano.
John Romano, yes.
Jillian Linnell.
Yes.
Eric Barassa.
Eric Barassa, yes.
Brian Kane.
Brian Kane, yes.
Leonard Diggins.
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Tom Kadzis.
Kadzis, yes.
Jim Fitzgerald.
Yes.
Jay Monty.
Yes.
David Kozis.
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz.
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
My understanding Heather Hamilton has left and Todd Corain is taking her place. Todd Corain.
Todd Corain, yes.
Tom Bent.
Bent, yes.
Austin Saganowitz.
Austin Saganowitz, yes.
Thatcher Keyser.
Thatcher Keyser, yes.
Darlene Wynn.
Darlene Wynn, yes.
Tina Cassidy.
Tina Cassidy, yes.
Peter Pelletier.
Peter Pelletier, yes.
And Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, John. Next item on the agenda is an action item on the FFY 2021 to 25 Transportation Improvement Program, Amendment number 3. Matt Genova.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry, having some struggling with the unmute here. Good morning, everyone. So today I'm here with two presentations. So we'll start briefly with an action item, as Mr. Chair noted, which is a proposed Amendment 3 to the federal fiscal years 2021 through 2025 Transportation Improvement Program. Amendment 3 makes adjustments to 4 Metro West Regional Transit Authority projects, all of which are currently programmed in federal fiscal year 2021. These changes are detailed on this slide and are also available on the MPO's meeting calendar for your review. Taking these in order, the first 2 projects listed here, improvements to the Framingham Commuter Rail Station and technology support and capital outreach, are proposed to have their funding levels reduced in federal fiscal year 2021 by $275,000 and $130,000 respectively. These changes are being made to align MWRTA's 2021 programming with their federally approved project list for this fiscal year. The third project listed here, MWRTA's Front Entrance Blandon project, is proposed to have an adjustment made to its funding sources. MWRTA has roughly $105,000 in federal fiscal year 2018 funding that is set to lapse at the end of this fiscal year. In order to utilize those funds, MWRTA is allocating them to this project and making a reduction of the same amount in the RTA capital assistance funds that were originally allocated to this project, and it will still cover the remainder of the project cost. Finally, MWRTA's 5339 replacement vehicles program has a proposed reduction in funding of $537,600. This change is being made because MWRTA has elected to defer some federal fiscal year 2021 replacement vehicle purchases to federal fiscal year 2022 based on the reduced usage of their fleet over the last year, as well as the current availability of replacement vehicles under contract. Because of the change in funding source from a non-federal to a federal source, as well as a project funding change of more than $500,000, these actions collectively meet the MPO's threshold for a TIP amendment, meaning these changes must be released for a 21-day public review period before being finalized. Pending a vote by this board, that review period will begin in the coming days, which puts Amendment 3 on track for a final vote at the MPO's first meeting in April. That's all I have on Amendment 3. So with that, I will turn it back over to the chair for questions and a vote on the amendment.
Thank you, Matt. Questions? Matt, I've just got one. The project, the Blandon Street project that they're taking federal money and putting to a project that they're going to fund with non-federal aid or changing their ratios. They're still within the 80-20 ratio, right?
I believe so, yes.
You believe so or you don't?
Of the 80-20, so the, well, they're using $105,000 in federal funds to supplement. Sorry.
Right. So how much is the project cost?
So the project cost is $975,000. So
and how much is the federal aid portion now?
The federal aid portion right now is 0.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Matt.
Yeah.
Other questions? Seeing none, can I get a motion and a second to release for a public review, 21-day public review process? And please state your name for the record. Thatcher Keyser.
Yes, Thatcher Keyser, Framingham. I make the motion to release for public comment.
Tina Cassidy.
And I would second that motion.
Motion having been made and seconded, Jonathan, please call the roll.
David Moeller,
Yes.
John Romano.
John Bouchard, yes.
Oh, John Bouchard is back. John Bouchard. John Romano.
John Romano, yes.
Jillian Linnell. Okay. Eric Barassa.
Eric Barassa, yes.
Brian Kane.
Brian Kane, yes.
Leonard Diggins.
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Tom Kansas.
Yes.
Jim Fitzgerald. Jim Fitzgerald.
Yes. Sorry.
Oh, thank you. Didn't hear it. Sorry. Jay Monty.
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis.
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz.
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Todd Corain.
Todd Corain, yes.
Tom Bent.
Tom Bent, yes.
Austin Saganowitz.
Austin Saganowicz, yes.
Thatcher Keyser.
Patrick Keyser votes yes.
Darlene Wynn.
Darlene Wynn votes yes.
Tina Cassidy.
T. Cassidy votes yes.
Peter Pelletier.
Peter Pelletier, yes.
And Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Jonathan. Next item on the agenda is the discussion of the FFY 2021 to 2026 preliminary project scenarios. Matt Genova.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair. For my second presentation today, I'll briefly discuss the first programming scenario proposal for the federal fiscal years 2022 through 2026 Transportation Improvement Program, which also includes addressing some of the project cost and schedule issues in 2021. And then we will open it up for a discussion at the end of the presentation on how this board would like to allocate the MPO's capital funds this year. Before we start, I do actually want to just jump back to the earlier conversation on estimating project costs and just respond to one of the questions that came up about cost discrepancies. So MPO staff work very closely with MassDOT staff to ensure that project costs in all tip materials are accurate. Costs have a way of changing very quickly at this time of year, as MassDOT project managers are making routine updates in support of the tip process every spring. So in some cases, the discrepancies between what we showed recently in some of the tip materials and what Deputy Chief Bouchard showed in his earlier slides are simply because the costs have been updated in recent days. And so the materials that were shown a few weeks ago would then subsequently be out of date. So MPO staff will continue to monitor project costs as they change between now and the end of tip programming this year, so later this month and into April and May. And we will continue to make updates to the tip materials as needed to reflect those new costs. So apologies for some of the confusion there, but I think some of that is relatively benign. For today's presentation, this is the ground that I intend to cover. I'll start with a quick reminder of where we are in this year's tip development timeline, and then we'll briefly highlight the written public comments submitted to this board since the last MPO meeting on February 18th. From there, we'll dive into the main portion of the presentation, which is the first staff scenario proposal for the fiscal years 22 through 26 tip. In closing, I'll touch on a handful of next steps before opening things up for what we hope will be a robust discussion. Before we start, I'd like to draw your attention to 5 separate files posted to the MPO meeting calendar under today's date, all of which can be resources for you as we proceed through the presentation and discussion. Available for your review are what's really the focus of today's presentation, a 2-page table that details tip scenario 1. Sections of that table will be reproduced on some of the slides that I'll show today, but having the full table pulled up will be helpful for you during today's discussion. Also available are a compilation of the written public comments submitted to the MPO since our last meeting on February 18th, 2 handouts containing 1-page summaries of every project currently programmed in the tip, as well as every new project seeking funding this year, and finally a 2-page table that provides some additional notes on currently funded projects that have significant readiness updates or cost changes. So there'll be a lot of overlap, possibly with some of the content that Deputy Chief Bouchard showed earlier, similar set of projects. But this last table is really a compilation of some of the takeaways from this board's last 2 meetings where many of these projects were discussed. So hopefully a lot of this information in that table will already be familiar to you. So at the outset, I also want to highlight the chief goal for today's conversation, which is for the MPO to build consensus on a scenario or multiple scenarios to carry forward into our next meeting on March 18th, which is when this board will discuss new projects, which new projects, if any, to fund in this year's TIP. Before we dive in, it's always useful to remind ourselves where we are in this year's TIP process. As I noted earlier, today's conversation will be focused on a discussion of a preliminary project scenario for the fiscal years 22 through 26 TIP. At the next MPO meeting on March 18th, we'll discuss scoring for all new projects being considered for funding this year, while also exploring scenarios that build on today's conversation. On March 25th, we'll need to have a final draft scenario agreed upon, as this scenario will be included in the draft TIP that we anticipate releasing for public review in late April. All of that puts us on track for a final TIP endorsement by this board in late May. So now I'd like to briefly highlight some of the public comments we've received, or rather all the public comments we've received on TIP projects since this board last met on February 18th. Again, the full text of these comments is available on the MPO meeting calendar for your review. Over the last 2 weeks, we received 13 public comments on 6 different current and prospective TIP projects. As always, I do want to extend my thanks to all project proponents and other stakeholders who have attended today's meeting, as well as MPO meetings in recent weeks to provide public comments, in addition to those who have submitted written comments, both for this week and for prior weeks. Collectively, your input is definitely a critical component of the TIP process and is highly valued by both the MPO board and staff. So taking these comments in alphabetical order by municipality, we received 3 comments on project number 609204, the Belmont Community Path, which is currently being scored by MPO staff in consideration for funding this year. These comments are in addition to the comments that we've heard on this project in recent meetings, which have come primarily from abutters of the proposed project route near the town center of Belmont. The comments this week are from Paul Kabutzi, Alex Corbett, and Annie Shee, and are in opposition to the proposed project path. The commenters expressed concerns about a number of issues, including the likely use of the path primarily as a commuter bikeway rather than a true path for members of the Belmont community, the project's high cost, the use of lighting on the path and its impact on neighbors, the privacy of abutters given the projected heavy use of the path by bicycle commuters and others, noise and litter from path users, possible land takings and easements, and the safety of future path users given the path's location adjacent to the Fitchburg commuter rail line. As abutters, some of the commenters feel their voices have not been appropriately taken into consideration throughout the project's route selection and design process, including at public meetings hosted by the town's Community Path Committee and the project's consultants. Generally, there's a feeling among commenters that a safer and more reasonable alternative routing of the path should be considered on the south side of the commuter rail tracks rather than the currently proposed route on the north side. Moving now to project number 609054, the reconstruction of Foster Street in Littleton. A letter submitted by Anthony Ansaldi, the town administrator, highlights the benefits the project will bring to the community, including enhancing access to the MBTA commuter rail station in Littleton and advancing the town's Complete Streets program and master plan. Mr. Ansaldi notes the project is proceeding ahead of schedule and that the town has committed the funding and resources needed to see the project through to completion. This project is currently programmed in federal fiscal year 2024, and the proponent has requested that this board consider moving it ahead to 2023 if funding becomes available. Next, a letter was submitted by David Kucharski, who also spoke earlier today, the traffic and parking director for the city of Salem. Mr. Kucharski writes in support of MPO funding for the Salem Skipper microtransit service through the MPO's 2022 Community Connections Program. The letter highlights that this service began on December 16, 2020 in partnership with Via Transportation. The service operates Monday through Saturday and provides low-cost rides within the city limits of Salem. The Salem Skipper has thus far provided roughly 3,000 trips in its first several weeks in operation, with ridership increasing over that time period. The letter notes that many trips are being made for essential reasons like accessing food, shopping, medical appointments, and school activities, and that ridership is at this level even while the service is operating with reduced capacity limitations due to the pandemic. Again, the proponent requests consideration of funding to support the continuation of this service through the 2022 Community Connections Funds. We also received a letter from Henry Hayes, the town manager for the town of Sudbury. Mr. Hayes writes in support of project number 608164, Phase 2D of the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail, which again, we also heard about earlier in today's meeting. Mr. Hayes advocates for the project to remain programmed in ETIP in federal fiscal year 2022, rather than being delayed to 2023, as the town and their consultant are moving rapidly on the project with plans to submit 75% designs next month. The letter notes some of the concerns expressed by MassDOT about the project's readiness, including the need for a no-rise analysis and concerns that the right-of-way process is behind schedule. Mr. Hayes highlights that the no-rise analysis has actually been completed and is no longer an issue, and that the town has recently made progress in advancing right-of-way discussions with MassDOT's rail division, who are the owners of the project corridor. The letter concludes by highlighting the robust support for the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail in Sudbury, which has been concretely demonstrated recently by the acquisition of the additional right-of-way south of Phase 2D that would allow for a future Phase 3 of the rail trail to be constructed. We received 6 letters of support for project number 610666, the Swampscott Rail Trail, which again, we also heard about during today's public comment period. Letters were submitted by town residents Ron Brooks, Judy Bevis, Mark Barden, and Roger Talkov. Letters were also submitted by local officials and advisory groups, including Pamela Angelakis, the superintendent of Swampscott Public Schools, Tanya Lilik, the chair of the town's Open Space and Recreation Plan Committee, and the Swampscott Conservancy. Collectively, the letters highlight the many benefits the project will provide for the town, including increased access to open space, recreation, and schools, the creation of new connections between neighbors, neighborhoods, and neighboring communities, the ability of the project to advance the goals set forth in the town's master plan, and the environmental benefits of planned native plantings along the path's route. Overall, the letter indicates robust support for the project throughout the Swampscott community. And finally, we received a letter from Jeffrey Hull, the town manager for the town of Wilmington. Mr. Hull writes in support of project number 609253, intersection improvements at Lowell Street and Woburn Street. This project is currently programmed in federal fiscal year 2024 of the TIP, but Mr. Hull requests that consideration be given to moving the project into an earlier fiscal year, a request that aligns with MassDOT's assessment of the project's current status as being ahead of schedule. Mr. Hull notes that moving the project forward would relieve some of the burden placed on the town's roadway by traffic detours caused by other ongoing infrastructure projects in the area, including the reconstruction of Main Street in Wilmington, 2 state bridge replacement projects, and the construction of the new Boston Street Bridge in neighboring Woburn. The letter states that the town has already committed funding to see the project through to 100% design, milestone that it anticipates reaching ahead of schedule at the end of calendar year 2021. Also briefly note that MPO staff received a handful of additional written comments within the last 24 hours or so. Those comments will be compiled and shared in full with this board at the next MPO meeting on March 18th. So with all that context, I'd like to dive into the heart of today's presentation, which is a discussion of the first programming scenario for the federal fiscal years 22 through 26 TIP. The table detailing scenario 1 is pretty information dense, so I wanted to briefly explain what everything means. And this will be similar to those who were at last week's MPO meetings, same formatting, but I wanted to make sure that we're all on the same page. Again, this table is available on the MPO's meeting calendar under today's date, so I encourage folks to keep that at the ready for the presentation and discussion. As a reminder, much of the information shown in the table comes from conversations between MassDOT staff and MPO staff back in February, when cost and schedule updates are discussed for all projects. All projects with a cost increase of more than $500,000 or 20% of project cost are shown in the table in red text. And as I noted earlier, you can see the precise amount of those changes on the right-hand side of the table. There are 3 different color codings that denote each project's current status. Projects highlighted in yellow have been flagged as high risk for not making their advertising date in their current fiscal year. Projects highlighted in purple have been recommended by MassDOT to be delayed due to a range of project-specific issues. And finally, projects in green have the potential to be moved into an earlier fiscal year because they are currently advancing ahead of schedule. All projects without highlighting have no notable updates to their readiness at this time. There's also a key posted towards the bottom of the second page of the table that denotes the color coding and defines the acronyms used throughout the table. So feel free to reference that if any of the information there is unclear. Again, I do want to highlight that we update this table as we go for every meeting, but things can certainly become out of date very quickly as project costs and status change. Things are changing especially quickly this time of year, so MPO staff will make sure to continue to update this information for each meeting to make sure that we're all on the same page about where things stand. So in order to arrive at today's programming scenario, there are a number of assumptions that have been made by MPO staff. First, all cost changes that we've discussed in recent weeks are reflected in the table. Second, as was talked about earlier, a 4% non-compounding inflation rate has been applied in each fiscal year beginning with 2023. That means that projects funded in 2023 have a 4% premium applied, 2024 projects have an 8% premium applied, and so on. This reflects current standard practice by MassDOT. Finally, the assumption is also made that this board will opt to retain full funding for the community connections and transit modernization programs as set forth in the current LRTP, or long range plan. So from there, staff took the following approach to craft the scenario. The scenario includes all other funding commitments, meaning all projects that this board has funded in the active fiscal years 21 through 25 TIP. These projects have been reorganized slightly so that all available funding in each fiscal year of the TIP is fully allocated. In just a moment, we'll walk through those adjustments year by year so you can understand all the dynamics at play. Overall, where do these changes land us in each fiscal year? So an overall summary of each year's funding is included on the second page of the handout for today, which is also shown on this slide before you. The current column represents what is programmed in the active fiscal years 2021 through 25 TIP, while the proposed column represents the scenario that will be the subject of today's conversation. As was said on the last slide, today's scenario maxes out funding for existing TIP projects in each fiscal year, resulting in a 5-year program with a net balance of $0. And that net balance is $0 even when you include the 2021 projects, which are not technically a part of this year's TIP, but which certainly need to be addressed for them to move forward. So you'll notice at the bottom of the table here that the total funding request for new projects is listed there. In 2022, we have roughly $3.7 million in applications for the Community Connections Program, with just $2 million in funding allocated to the program in that year in the scenario that we'll review today. That means that in the scenario, we'll only be able to fund a little over half of the funding request for community connections this year. In 2026, you'll see that the total funding request for all other TIP projects is approaching $350 million when inflated by our 16% inflation rate for fiscal 26. So in this scenario, no funding would be available to cover any of this request. So as I mentioned in my presentation on February 18th, we'll continue to do a gut check throughout these conversations to understand how each possible scenario relates to the goals that have been set forth for the distribution of MPO funds across project types in the MPO's long-range transportation plan. As you can see here, scenario 1 is overprogrammed on major infrastructure by roughly 5 percentage points, and is also slightly overprogrammed on bicycle network and pedestrian connections projects. These discrepancies are largely due to changing costs for these projects since this board initially elected to fund them in prior TIP cycles. You'll also notice that scenario 1 is slightly under this board's 45% funding target for complete streets, and is also slightly under the 13% target for intersection improvements. We're currently on target for funding community connections at $2 million annually. And again, because it's a new investment program as of last year, there are just 2 fiscal years of funding in the baseline scenario for transit modernization. So as that program continues to roll out in coming fiscal years, the discrepancy between the goal that we set at 5% of funding and the amount of funding that we have actually allocated to it will continue to shrink. So I'll highlight again that this chart is available on the bottom of page 2 of the scenario table posted today, and you'll see updated versions of this analysis with each coming scenario. All right. So now I'll walk through the decisions made in each fiscal year of the TIP to clarify how scenario 1 was created. So we'll begin with fiscal year 2021, which again is not included in the forthcoming 2022 through 26 TIP. But again, we must address these projects as part of the broader TIP programming conversation for this year to allow those projects to move forward in their current fiscal year, which is between now and the end of September 2021. So in the coming weeks, we will discuss an amendment to the fiscal years 21 through 25 TIP. So this will be another amendment, likely an amendment 4 to the TIP. And that amendment will happen alongside our programming conversations for the new forthcoming 22 through 26 TIP, but will allow, again, some of those 2021 projects to move forward towards advertisement for construction in a timely manner, which needs to happen again before September 30th of this year. So the table shown on this slide is pulled from the larger scenario 1 table that we've shared for today's meeting. Again, I encourage everyone to have that pulled up for reference as we move through each fiscal year. So diving into 21, there are 2 key adjustments made to bring the TIP into fiscal constraint. First, the intersection improvement project on Route 2A in Littleton and Ayer has been delayed until 2022. This project won't be ready for advertisement in this fiscal year, as it cannot move forward with the right-of-way and environmental approval processes it needs to until 75% designs have been submitted. Because these processes can be time-consuming, and because this project is currently sitting at 25% design, it's anticipated that there will not be enough time to complete these steps before September 30th. The other key decision here is that roughly $4 million in funding for the reconstruction of Ferry Street in Everett is shifted from 2021 to 2022. This change doesn't impact the overall schedule of the project, but does allow the 2021 TIP to get back into fiscal constraint while allowing all other 2021 projects to move forward as planned. Moving now to 2022, which will be the first year of the new 5-year TIP. Scenario 1 shows the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail in Sudbury and Concord, as well as the intersection improvement project on Route 1A in Norwood, retained in fiscal year 22. Both of these projects were flagged by MassDOT as possibly needing to be moved into 2023, but may have the capacity to stay in their current year, as was discussed earlier with some of these. I'll emphasize here that ultimately the decision to move or not move any given project is up to this board. During today's discussion, we can continue to talk about which options work best in any given year, which will build on this presentation, as well as the information that John Bouchard covered earlier in today's meeting. So scenario 1 also shows Norwood's intersection improvement project on Route 1 at University Avenue and Everett Street, moved from 2022 to 2025 and 2026. This change is both due to readiness concerns as well as to a significant cost increase for this project, escalating from just under $10 million to roughly $23 million. Because of the financially constrained nature of the TIP, the project had to move to the first year where funding could be made available without delaying multiple other projects. MassDOT's recommendation was to move the project out 2 years to 2024, so the extra year here in 2025 is really due to those financial limitations. Scenario 1 also shows the reconstruction of Route 129 in Lynn, moved from 2022 to 2023 because of MassDOT's concerns about whether or not the project can achieve its required right-of-way and environmental approvals in time for a 2022 advertisement. So not shown on this slide, but discussed on the last slide is the second year of funding for Everett's Ferry Street project, the second year of funding for the Sumner Tunnel reconstruction, and the rescheduled funding of Route 2A in Littleton and Ayer. So collectively, all of these additions and changes allow 2022 to zero out on net. In 2023, you'll see the Linfield Street project added to the mix. Because of the addition of $6.6 million in 2023 required to cover this project, along with cost increases for other projects in 2023, the amount programmed for the reconstruction of Rutherford Avenue in Boston has been decreased by roughly $14 million in this fiscal year. This again allows the fiscal year to stay within its funding limitations with no other new changes required to accomplish this. In 2024, we actually have a similar story. No projects are moved into or out of this fiscal year, but because of cost increases for other projects, the amount of funding allocated to Rutherford Avenue is decreased by a relatively modest $5.4 million. In 2025, we have a little bit more going on. The funding level for Rutherford Avenue is again adjusted here, decreasing by $4 million to allow some extra breathing room for other changes to other projects. So as was mentioned earlier, scenario 1 shows 2025 as the first year of funding for the Route 1 intersection project in Norwood. This project is now shown as having its funding split over 2 years as the adjusted cost of the project, that is the cost with our standard 4% inflation rate applied each year, now exceeds $25 million, which is the threshold we have for considering multi-year funding schedules. As you can see here, as well, the rehabilitation of Route 16 in Milford has also been moved out a year in scenario 1. This is the only project in this scenario that was delayed strictly for cost reasons, as this project cost has more than doubled since last fiscal year, due largely to the addition of shared use paths to the project's proposed design. The project is now shown funded at a cost of just under $10.5 million in fiscal year 2026. And finally, we arrive at 2026, the last year of funding in the forthcoming TIP. So as was noted on the last slide, 2026 is now the second year of funding for the Route 1 project in Norwood at a level of slightly more than $15 million. In addition to the rescheduled Milford project that I just mentioned, the only other project funded in fiscal 2026 outside of our programmatic commitments to community connections and transit modernization is Rutherford Avenue. When the MPO made the decision to fund this project several years ago, it was anticipated that the funding would be distributed over a 5-year construction schedule. The allocation of $72 million to this project in 2026 is an attempt to adhere to that timeline as closely as possible. In this scenario, 2026 would be the project's 5th year of funding, but there would still be roughly $8.5 million in project cost that has yet to be allocated in this TIP. That means that Rutherford Avenue would need a 6th year of funding in 2027 to close out our commitment to that project, which may or may not be allowable for the project's construction timeline. So we can come back to that subject during the discussion today. And we'll keep evaluating options for that as we move forward. So where does all this leave us? Again, scenario 1 allocates every available dollar in each fiscal year while retaining all existing projects and their associated cost and schedule changes. We're also able to maintain our stated goal of fully funding the community connections and transit modernization programs. In scenario 1, these program budgets are the only funds available for potential allocation to new projects in the TIP this year. And finally, even though the financial challenges faced in this TIP are sizable, only 4 projects are moved into later fiscal years, only one of which is due purely to funding limitations. So today's presentation was obviously very information dense. There's a lot going on in this scenario. So I'm happy to clarify anything that we've discussed so far, in addition to addressing any questions this board has on project readiness and cost. This will build on our conversation from earlier. Ideally, today's conversation will focus mostly on evaluating the approach taken in scenario 1, including a discussion of whether or not we should make an effort to free up additional funds for new projects this year, as well as comments on any of the year-by-year changes and potential alternatives to those. So again, our goal for today is to build board consensus on scenario or scenarios to move forward with in coming weeks, clarifying how much funding, if any, will be available for new projects this year. So before we discuss those topics, I'll briefly highlight where we're heading in the coming weeks. At the next MPO meeting on March 18th, we'll go into more detail on project scoring for the new projects seeking MPO funding this year. We'll do that in the context of some updated scenarios, discussing how new projects can fit into the TIP program if this board elects to do that. On March 25th, we'll arrive at a draft 5-year plan, which will be released for a 21-day public review period in late April. And with that, I will turn it back over to the chair to begin the discussion.
Thank you, Matt. Well done. Questions, Lynn Diggins, or comments? Lynn?
Thank you. Actually, my hand was left up from the vote. But anyways, I just have a quick question now for Matt. And Matt, for actually maybe you as well, Mr. Chairman. So do we have to program every dollar maybe for a given year? I mean, can we keep some dollars in reserve?
Yes, you can keep dollars in reserve.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Brian King.
Thank you, David. Following up on what Len was asking, I was going to ask a similar question. And I guess as a comment, I would say that I think we should seriously consider giving ourselves a break and not programming to zero every year, especially in the out years, especially in the 2026s, 2025s, where we know we're going to go through this squeeze in the toothpaste tube exercise again. I really think we need to take 5% or something of the total and leave it unprogrammed, because there will be additional cost overruns. We know that's going to happen and things are going to move. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Brian. Eric Barassa?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have just a couple questions, Matt. Does any of the change in sort of the Rutherford cash flows, does any of that assume that the cost goes into 2027? I apologize if you covered this.
It does. So right now we have about $8.5 million that would be remaining to fund that just doesn't fit in this scenario, given the financial constraints. So I guess we're sort of at the point where we need to develop sort of a better understanding of the construction schedule for that project. And if that's possible to extend 1 extra year, then that's something that could be on the table as an option. Alternatively, if that's not possible and the project needs to stick to a 5-year schedule, then we would have to look at potentially moving around some other projects to free up funding to allow it to move forward on that 5-year schedule.
So I feel like getting that determination, I think it's from MassDOT about the schedule is really critical. So I don't know if that's something that they have, weighed in on, because I know that makes a big difference, I think. Also, my other question was just, I know you had reduced a lot of the cash flows in the nearer years to put it into the outer years. And again, I know that sometimes the cash flows can be fudged a little, but I just would also want to make sure that that's something that MassDOT has been able to, sign off of. Because I know we did that with the Green Line a lot, but there was times when David said, well, we do need to be able to make sure that there is enough money in those years to actually, fund the work that's happening. So I think, I don't know if David, I don't know if you are able to provide any insight into that question, but I feel like that's a critical one, since the strategy of this scenario really hinges on being able to move Rutherford cash flows and then move some of the funding into 2027.
Well, before I answer, I think Peter has his hand up, so I'll call on him first in case he also wants to talk about Rutherford. Tim?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just first wanted to say, thanks to the MPO for continued support of the Rutherford project. It's obviously a very big, significant project. And I think, especially with the later years where we're pushing, the resources out to the later years. One thing that we would like to throw into the mix here, I think some folks know that, we have a commitment from the casino resources for $2.5 million over a 10-year period that started a couple of years ago. So I think we want to put that kind of $25 million into the mix here to try to make up for some of the cost overruns of Rutherford and to try to help out, especially with the later years, last year or two, to try to cover those costs. I think it's going to require the city to float, that money before we actually receive it, which again, won't be fully received out until about 2029. But I think the city is willing to find a way to take on, floating that additional coverage of those resources before we actually receive them. So I just wanted to put that into the mix for kind of future consideration, especially for the out years where we're pushing a lot of the money out to the out years.
Thank you, Jim. And for our purposes, to answer Eric's question, it is definitely true that we do not use cash flow to balance the tip, okay? Cash flow needs to track construction. So we will have to look at the numbers Matt provided and look at the actual, what we believe the spend on this project will be. There's always some give and take, right? It doesn't have to be dollar for dollar because we can't even estimate dollar for dollar, but you can't rob the early years and have a giant balloon payment in the last years. So no, that's probably not possible. The other issue I want to note, and I hope John Bouchard's still on the phone, is I believe that we are at MassDOT reassessing our readiness days analysis of Rutherford. We had said it was high risk. I think now we're thinking it has tipped over from high risk to we would actually recommend we delay a year, the start. That will free up $10 million, I think, in 22, but will require $10 million more in 23 through 27 now, I guess. But John, are you on still?
I am still on, David.
So John, correct me if I'm wrong, or restate it if I've stated it incorrectly. But again, we do need to sit with the city to talk about this in greater detail. But I think we're feeling more and more like this is an FY23 project, not an FY22 project. Is that right?
That's correct, David. I think you described it best. Is that we were on the fence a little bit at readiness days, and we had not had a solid conversation with the city
And, but yeah, we were kind of on the fence that we thought that it should move out one more year at least. And we support going out to 23, starting in 23.
Which would obviously take a year of cash flow from the beginning and put it on the end. Okay.
Right.
Other questions or comments about this project or other Tom Katzis?
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks, John, on the comment. Anything the city, and you're right, it's complicated. You guys have to make a decision, even if we're on the fence, but the city and we're confident, but we obviously have to follow your lead. And one idea, Mr. Chair, in the case that things do change, to minimize the procedural moves to make corrections, if we could put a toehold in that 22, then would that make any future amendments less easy to do? In other words, instead of an amendment, it would be an adjustment, etc. I just leave that suggestion as you come up with your final determination. Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks, John.
Other questions, comments on this issue or other issues? Before I call on members of the public, are there any other MPO members at this time? See, oh, Lynn Diggins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I'll suggest the way that we keep that toehold is like anytime we move something out, because it's not ready, that we don't program that money, that we just keep it. Because as Mr. Kane said, we can anticipate some increases, and that becomes our reserve. And we determine as an MPO what reserve we want to have. When we maybe in 2027 going forward. And so yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Ken Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this is a question to Matt. I'm just a question on what it means when in terms of comments, when it says that 25% comments received, for example. Does that mean that the responses to comments were received by MassDOT, or that the MassDOT transmitted their 25% comments to the proponent?
Yeah, so it's the latter. So that means MassDOT has reviewed the submission and sent comments back to the designer, and then
So that could say 100% comments transmitted. Then I guess would be.
Yeah, it could.
Yeah, okay, but that's what it means. That's fine. You don't need to change it. Just want to understand that. And just to Brian's point about leaving a reserve, I understand the appeal of doing that. Costs do go up sometimes beyond the 4% annual inflation. On the other hand, that would be implying that the MPO is accepting of cost increases and will fund cost increases of projects regardless. I think to David's point about just being accepting of, and I think one of the public commenters saying, hey, what is the incentive to keep costs under control if the MPO is just gonna eat it every time costs go up? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ken. Brian King.
Thanks, Ken. I hear what you're saying. I guess what I'm suggesting is that by adding a reserve, the MPO is not implicitly saying we accept that costs are going to go up. However, we are also recognizing reality, which is that costs go up. Barring a major recession, construction costs are going to continue to go up in this region, especially for transportation projects. So, I would suggest it's not a question of capitulating. It's a question of just being wise with the taxpayers' money. But I understand your point as well. Thanks.
Lynn Diggins.
Yes, and to that end, Mr. Miller's right. I mean, is that it is a bit of a moral hazard that we have found ourselves in now. But I am assuming that that will be the policy until we decide to change the policy. I mean, and I can imagine, us changing the policy and saying that, but until we do, then I think it's prudent for us to keep the monies in reserve, because we're doing folks a disservice. If we tell them your project's going to start at a certain time and they then start planning for that, and then because of shortfalls that we perhaps could have anticipated, we then push their project out. So until we have changed our approach, then we need to keep the reserve in order to do not do more of a disservice to the folks that are counting on us. Thank you.
Ken?
Thank you. And again, I understand an alternative would be to change the inflation rate. The 4% is our default recommendation, the federal default recommendation, but nothing prevents the MassDOT or the MPO from doing an analysis and using a higher or lower rate. So that may be another way of doing that without leaving. And that way you can see if a particular project goes beyond whatever your inflation rate, a higher inflation rate, say, would be, then you could maybe ask them real questions as to why any particular project is beyond that inflation rate. Thank you.
Brian King?
Question for you, Mr. Chair. What would be the proper venue or approach to discuss such policy questions as having a reserve on the tip, or funding only a fixed amount, or messing with the inflation rate, as Mr. Miller suggested?
Right, so I would think we would put an agenda item on maybe the next agenda to start talking about these issues. I mean, the other question is whether we're trying to adopt these issues for this tip or begin a discussion. I can see it working either way. But I would also think if we're going to do that, then members need to let staff know of any ideas they've thought of and might have, right? And then staff can put together some, and staff is free to have their own ideas. Okay, I'm not saying that staff doesn't have ideas. Of course, Matt has ideas. So people, I think we could have a policy discussion at the beginning of the next meeting to talk about what is our policy on cost overruns, so-called, and inflation, and reserving some money, and are we going to, instead of making, there have been cases in other MPOs where the MPO took a position for a particular project of, we've given you a number, design to that number, and if you can't design to that number, then the community needs to fund the overage because we're done and this is how much we can pay. I'm not saying that should be our policy, but there are all sorts of different permutations you could have about a policy about that. But we never seem to actually, to your point, Brian, get to the place where we're going to talk about policy, because we're always in this, oh my God, we've got to get our tip done cycle. Lynn?
So I would suggest, Mr. Chair, if you agree, that we add that to the next agenda, start having the discussion, and I certainly will share with Matt Genova some ideas that I have.
Yeah, I think, Brian, that we will put that as the first item after our normal chair's report, Tagan's report, Lynn's report. Put that as the first item on the agenda, the first substantive item on the agenda. And the next meeting, my expectation is the next meeting will just be about the tip. So I hope we can have enough time to talk about it. Lynn?
I'm all for that. So I will be in touch also with email or voice means. So that'll be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Tom Bent.
Yeah, I'm kind of glad that this came up. I agree also, because we have to start getting control on cost, because I know, and Matt, I don't remember which project it was. I know there's one that I think doubled in cost, from 5 million to 10 million. And it sounded like in your description that it was all scope creep. So, that should be a discussion that we're having, is that, well, why was there scope creep here? And are we willing to fund that? And I think, typically we have done that. But I think, like Ken said earlier, is there any, there's no, it's almost like we're people know that we're just going to do that. So I think, again, I think this is timely and that we need to really have that discussion. Thank you.
You're welcome, Tom. Thank you. Other comments from MPO members? Tom Katzis.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Just one more on this. John had mentioned it regarding MassDOT is, it seems like one place to send it back to municipalities would be at the PIC level. It seems like once it gets to the MPO, it gets a little more political versus if it's at the MassDOT project level, it's more technical. And it's, in my opinion, I throw that out. In some ways, I know that puts the pressure on MassDOT, but it seems like it's more technical versus, I mean, we see the burden, the pressure and all the investments that municipalities carry forward. Maybe MassDOT could be more aggressive in terms of having people in for a second look. It might be a cop-out on my way, but I think it's a practical cop-out in terms of the MPO. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Tom, other comments? Seeing none, Emily Keller.
Thank you very much, David. A couple of things. I'm really impressed that you guys are letting the public see how this sausage is made, and the brainstorming that you're encouraging, Mr. Moeller, for your members to take and start kind of a new phase. I hope you will do it during this tip and not have to put it off until the next one. And I know that this infrastructure is really important, and federal funding obviously has been lacking for quite a long time, which sort of contributes to the problem. I'm now putting on my Bruce Freeman Rail Trail hat, and I just wanted to say that Ms. Lee's presentation, I read some of the material before today, and she was emphasizing that you're working on identifying trails and sidewalks to enhance access to transit. And I wanted to remind you all that the next phase, the phase 2D of the Concord-Sudbury Bruce Freeman Rail Trail, will allow access to an MBTA train station that goes into Boston and Pittsburgh. So that's pretty significant for the cost of that construction. Thank you very much, and I'll probably see you at the next couple MPO meetings until you vote. And oh, one other thing. I guess if a lot of the overage and moving things around didn't happen, you wouldn't have to take an hour and a half of public comments advocating for each individual project. Anyway, thank you all.
Other comments or questions at this time? Lynn Diggins. Lynn, can you unmute Lynn, please? Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's actually on my end. I can explain why it's a mix up. But anyways, it's my fault. Since I think we were about to kind of change gears a little bit, on with respect to one of the projects, the Belmont Pass, we're getting a lot of comments from the public that are negative about this. And I have been. I know how this goes. Usually people who are against the project are the ones who are most verbal about it. And I don't know what to think about the project. And I don't think that all of us should be responsible in trying to sort out what's really going on with that project. And so I'm wondering if maybe we can get some help on assessing the comments about it. I don't know who's the representative from that region, but it's just a request for help, and helping me determine how to feel about it. That's all. Thank you.
You're welcome, Lynn. So on that, Matt, let me ask a question. To Lynn's point, for the last several meetings, people have taken the time and the effort to either write in or come to the meetings and talk about the project and their opposition to it and their feeling that they haven't been heard at the local level. Now, I'm taking no position on whether any of that is true, but has Belmont I know I think they've sent us a letter, but have they come in and talked about their project?
Yes, you are correct that last summer, in response to some earlier comments on this project, Belmont sent a multi-page letter sort of detailing some of the efforts that they've taken to engage abutters and other community members on the project. So I'd be happy to bring that back just for reference, so that folks have it. And then, yeah, I mean, we have had some conversations with the town, and let them know that folks are commenting and encourage them to to respond. And they've said that they're working on a response now, so I can follow up with them to see if they're willing to
You
come
should
speak.
probably follow up with them and tell them that the MPO is getting more and more concerned that they're not coming to talk about their project, right? We've been down this road before where we funded a project and then said, oh, well, maybe we shouldn't have. And again, taking no substantive, like Lynn, I don't know, right? I'm taking no substantive decision on this project, but they need to come to the MPO and probably discuss their project and their commitment to it still, even in the face of the public opposition, right? We don't want to take up money on a project that the city may decide they don't, or the town may decide they don't want to do. And I don't think this is that project, but it'd be nice to hear it from them.
Absolutely.
Ken Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that's a very good point. It would be great to hear, and particularly my recollection of this project. One of the questions was why it was on the north side of the tracks rather than the south side of the tracks, which seems to be wrong. By. So that would be important to know the answer to that question. But speaking of projects that were maybe somewhat controversial, it would be great at some point, don't need it now, to get an update on Melnia Cast and what's going on with that.
Yeah, yes, that will happen in the future, Ken. I don't want to get in the way of the tip development, but for those of you who don't know, the MPO funded the Melnia Cast project. Much like the Belmont Path, actually, after a lot of opposition expressed at the MPO level, we nonetheless went ahead and funded the project. The city has now decided that they want to redesign that project. So that project is going to be redesigned, and we will need to talk about it at some point in the future, because the MPO did fund the project and there's money allocated to the project from a previous tip cycle that we need to talk to you guys about at some point when we know more about what we're doing. Thanks, kid. Others? Other MPO members before I call it back onto the public? Tom Bradden.
Hi, I served on the Framingham Knobscott right of way, basically the Bruce Freeman in Framingham, the study group that Framingham established. And when we held our public presentations, we got quite a few comments, and it's understandable that people, the abutters, have grown used to the sections of right-of-way that have been in disuse. They've become used to kind of thinking of them as just extensions of their backyard to some degree, and they're not. But we went through all of the comments, and there were comments that, people have legitimate concerns about privacy, and they'll lose some privacy putting in a trail. But at the same time, there were comments that were less realistic, like things about how they were worried about we would start spraying with DDT, and that we were just going to slaughter any of the animals like deers and things like that, and we were going to be hit with someone commented about worried about someone was going to break into their house and steal their TV and run off with it on a bicycle. And you have to take some of the comments with a grain of salt. and understand that there's a reflection of legitimate concern, but sometimes it's wrapped in comments that they're just grasping at straws. And you have to differentiate the real concerns and how to deal with those. And some of the comments, it was kind of weird because I was one of the people sitting up there taking questions and answering questions as best I could. And Bill Hansen, who served on he was chair of the bike committee I served on, told me later on he was sitting behind two gals that were pointing at me and said, well, he's probably a drug head. And I've never even been drunk. So, I mean, some of this stuff comes at you, and you need to realize that they do have some legitimate concerns, but this kind of emotional backlash, complaints that, we've never heard anything about this, when you've been advertising it for a year, and you've been sending news reports to every abutter about the progress on things and inviting them to meetings. You can't take some of that personally. You have to kind of separate your own emotion out and realize that wrapped in some of the vitriol, there is some legitimate concerns that you have to address, and try to approach it in sorting through these things, that realize that people are going to, most of the projects we've worked on, and the project with the Cochituate, the few abutters we've had, they've been delighted with the trail afterwards. It's a nice amenity, and the people are getting out and using it. And we've had people come in and approach us and say that they'd been against it, and they realized that there was no reason for that. But you kind of expect some of that resistance to these projects. It's unusual when you think that this is really best to serve them, and you can't have a perfect response, I think, is the real question. But you can try to deal with the concerns as best you can.
Thank you, Mr. Branton.
Thank you.
Matthew Peterson.
Great. I'll just be really brief, kind of on a similar note. And I just would note that the MPO meetings and the MPO itself is perhaps not the most known and recognized governmental institution in the greater Boston region. And I would say that probably of the people who are going to submit a comment, there's people who might have read something in the paper that, oh, there's a bike trail going through something, but somebody who's going to might write out it casually with their kid or something, they're not even necessarily going to know that they should write a letter of support to the MPO meeting that meets twice a month or whatever. So I would just say that, I think when you do get these letters of opposition for any given project, it does filter for somebody who's already kind of hyper attuned to these sort of things and knows where the forums are to discuss these, and maybe doesn't catch the whole reflection of the community. So that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you. Any other comments or concerns at this time? Seeing none, I do have one thing I need to say. So there's another cash flow in the tip, which is the GLX project. We have not made the final transfer of the funds for FY21. We are analyzing whether we need to make that transfer at this time or not. It may be a possibility that we can let the MPO keep that money this year and transfer in the future if we need it at all. So we don't have more to say than that today, but there is a possibility that $21 million, I think it's 21 million, it might be 22. Whatever the number is in 21 may be available actually to help fill the gap on cost overruns. Other questions or comments at this time? Seeing none, Matt, do you need anything more from us today?
I mean, I think with, some of the new information that we've discussed today, we have enough to start working on one or perhaps multiple other scenarios to consider. So I think I have a general sense of, some of the themes that members raised. So, so I think we have enough to work with. And obviously, we still have a lot of questions to answer in the coming two discussions, but we'll look forward to it.
Excellent. And I would remind members, if you have something you want Matt to specifically prepare or put in the policy discussion, please let him know, let Tegan know. Thank you, Matt, very good job. Any other items to come before the MPO at this time? Seeing none, can I get a motion and a second from a member, and please state your name for the record to adjourn? Brian Kane.
Brian Kane gladly moves to adjourn.
Tina Cassidy.
And Tina gladly moves to second that motion.
Motion has been made and seconded. We are adjourned without objection. Thank you all very much. See you in 2 weeks, guys.